There's a reason the government is hiding it from the public. UFOs, UAPs, whatever you want to call them. Soon, they're going to have to come clean. At least, about parts of it. There's no way they'll be honest about the worst of it. Why it's been secret for so long. I will. I don't expect this to stay up for long. I bet my computer's been bugged for the past 10 years. So listen carefully. I want you to be ready. I used to be a wildlife photographer. That's why it was such a shock to me when men in black suits show up at your house, tell you that you've been selected for a new job working for NASA. You'd expect they'd be looking for a physicist or a biologist or something. I thought it was a joke until one of them flashed the badge. The other one stretched just so, accidentally revealing the gun he was concealing at his waist. I wasn't even a particularly good wildlife photographer. Maybe that's why they chose me. No awards, no family, no friends, no criminal record. Hell, I didn't even have any pets. Guess that was all the resume they needed. Had to take a plane there for my first day. New housing on site, they said. Pack lightly. My new post was at the High Point Special Facility. Maybe you've heard of it in the news. It's a government compound out in the mountains, not too far from Washington, D.C., where US leadership is meant to stay if something threatens their safety in the city. Allegedly, it's owned and operated by FEMA. So why would I work there? Because they've been lying. Under the facility, there are miles and miles of tunnels, fortified, maze-like corridors and rooms expansive enough to create a dark, cool, subterranean city. There were laboratories, libraries, a factory, aircraft hangars, surgical theatres. They needed a documentarian. Didn't want to waste someone more important on taking pictures. I don't think I was even really working for NASA, even if nobody said otherwise. At first, I didn't really understand what I was taking pictures of. I wasn't stupid enough to ask. I assumed they chose someone who couldn't make sense of it on purpose. I'd be taken to a room where there'd be some machine parts or an engine sitting out on a table. I'd take pictures, supervised by people in lab coats who would direct me to certain portions or angles. Over time, pieces got more complete. One time, I took a picture of some sort of circuit-looking thing that shorted out my camera after I got too close. Just came apart in my hands with a burst of blue sparks. Burned me pretty bad. Had to switch from digital to film after that. And then one day, it clicked. Maybe about a year in. They had me go to the surgical theatre, suited me up like a marshmallow in a gas mask. I was to photograph an autopsy. An autopsy? I remember thinking that they must have been a victim of some covert technological experiment gone wrong. But then, they wheeled out the body. It wasn't a person at all. It was small, vaguely person-shaped, but it was put together wrong. A sick little part of me almost laughed. It looked like a cartoon alien. Big eyes, big head, grey skin. But then they started cutting into it, and it was very, very real. I had to photograph each organ. I drank myself to sleep that night. Place was big enough to have a bar, even if I couldn't leave to get my own liquor. Guess my reaction was good enough though, because instead of my regular work the next day, I was sent to a big meeting room. Needed a photographer's input, they said, Make sure I don't talk about this to anyone else. We were given pseudonyms. The head of the project was Aquila, a rough-looking older guy who sounded like he might have been from New York. There were scientists, quiet, smart people. I can't even remember what they were called. Most of what they said flew over my head. I was introduced to Sagitta, Cygnus, and Canis, our prospective astronauts. I was Pyxis. Cygnus told me this was the name of a constellation shaped like a telescope. I wonder if she thought it was funny. Aquila informed us that we were a small part of a greater project. Greater as in the greater scope, but also greater as in grand. We were to help with the development of a manned super camera. Project ANTAEUS. The technology I'd been photographing had been de-engineered and re-engineered, all with the purpose of developing faster than light travel. We were almost there. Project ANTAEUS was meant to practice sending manned craft into deep space. ANTAEUS and its crew were to travel to Mars, orbit for about 3 months, and return. This was the first time I decided to speak up. "Why am I here?" my voice cracked. "Because," he replied, "we need someone to teach our astronauts about wildlife photography. We need evidence of live extraterrestrials." So my job became accompanying the 3 astronauts as they underwent their training and teaching them about photography techniques in an unstable environment with an unpredictable subject. The ANTAEUS' camera was more powerful than anything I'd ever had my hands on, but there was no data to train an AI to look for a moving alien. We had no idea what we might be looking for, really. We'd only ever seen their ships up close after they'd been destroyed. It was less eventful for a while. Everyone was focused on ANTAEUS. I saw ships enter the hangar though. Not ours. Long, cigar-shaped craft, built from metal that looked like it had been crushed and folded and melded together so many times it had become smooth. Bodies inside without any evidence of a door. Cygnus told me rumours about ships flying up out of the ocean, about cattle being found bloodless and boneless without visible injury, missing children. She told me in whispers, in writing, in looks and gestures. I wasn't meant to know. She felt bad for me. So much information without any answers. One night she slipped into my quarters. It was close to the launch date. She had told her superiors she wanted to thank me. She asked me for a token to take with her, so she could think of me. I gave her my watch. After she left, I found a piece of paper folded into my pocket. It must have come from the library, because none of us had access to a computer or to a printer. The paper looked old, worn, like a vintage book from the 70s. It was a photo of a clay tablet, half unburied from an archaeological dig. It even had those little flags around the hole. And on the tablet were drawings of people. And they were looking up, at the sky, at other beings with big heads and stubby bodies, beings coming down from the stars. I ripped up the paper and flushed it down the toilet. I couldn't afford to be caught with it. I don't know if Cygnus thought she was helping me by showing me that, or if she just needed someone to share it with, to carry the burden with her. I never got the chance to ask. We were close. Too close. I wish she were here to help me explain. ANTAEUS left. The first red flag was when the radio refused to work. Rest of the ship was okay though, from what we could tell back home. We weren't meant to receive the first photographs for a couple of weeks. We did, however, receive more visitors in the meantime. More sightings. I was tasked with editing photographs taken from satellite. I was sent into hangars alone to photograph orbs that spun without a power source, four-fingered hands that smelled of ammonia, a flat, black mirror 30 feet across. Things that felt wrong. The first transmission we received was beautiful. Someone up top had the kindness to let me look. Heavenly bodies in blue and gold and yellow, galaxies spreading like watercolor across the expanse of space, each taken with a delicate human touch. Art, really, but not what we were looking for. Back to silence, back to work, back to little grey corpses and empty hallways. The next spate of images was more unsettling. Again, the first few were gorgeous. A shot of Earth in swirling colour, distant stars, Earth's moon, the moons of Jupiter. Something in this next one. A faint outline, inorganic. A ship. No amount of editing could make it clear though. And silence again. I was slipping up, losing time. I'd look up and hours would pass. Aquila told me I'd be released from my tour of duty at the end of ANTAEUS' mission. I wondered if that meant I'd be killed. ANTAEUS relayed more photos. A perfect shot of a non-human spacecraft, just like the ones we had here. Something had compressed it so tightly around the middle that it had split in half. Bodies backlit by sun, floating in space. Twisted, squat bodies. Another mangled ship. A photograph of ANTAEUS. How? Aquila asked me how. I don't know, I told him. I didn't teach them how to do that. Foreign objects arrived at the facility more frequently and in greater numbers. I was busier than ever, alone on the job more than ever. Sometimes I didn't even have to decontaminate between rooms before a faceless voice on an intercom would tell me to move on to the next. I was called in to take photographs of an autopsy. No time to put on a hazmat suit, the intercom said. Just had to go in with a hollowed carcass. It was peeled open, skin and ribs, the petals of a fleshy flower. Each organ had been carefully placed in a tray, ready for documentation. Being near the body made my skin tingle. Not in a nervous way. I was used to the dead by now. The body was having a physical effect on me. Lights flashed when I blinked. I crept nearer. Nestled in the open cavity of its chest was a watch. Slick black with congealed blood. It was my watch. I was dizzy. I was burning. Shaking, I clicked my camera before I gave in and stumbled into the hallway to vomit. How? So many people were asking me like I would have an answer. How? I had to take a polygraph. It had my watch. I don't know how. Cygnus had my watch. From Earth, everything aboard the ANTAEUS seemed fine, except for the radio. Days passed. My skin reddened and dried and flaked off like a sunburn. They must have decided to trust me again, because they had me return to working. There was another body. My watch again was found amongst its organs. I was asked more questions I couldn't answer. I asked them how many copies of my watch they'd already found. They told me I didn't have high enough clearance to know. More pictures from ANTAEUS. Another photograph of the ship. A different one. This one was smashed flat. A hunk of sheet metal fell into the Atlantic Ocean, belonging to ANTAEUS. But our ANTAEUS was still up there in space. Someone in the organization recovered the ANTAEUS from where it crashed in the mountains of Alaska. But we kept receiving visual transmissions from the ship. From Earth, everything aboard the ANTAEUS seemed fine. The super camera captured 1,000 copies of the ANTAEUS, floating like sleeping whales. Thousands of suspended bodies, backlit, humanoid. And something else was there. Not a black hole. A black hole can't look back. But it was taking things in. Eating things. Satellites, moons. Copying them, crushing them, spitting them back out. Changing them. Those mangled bodies, those cigar-shaped ships. Each one was from Earth, weren't they? Each autopsy, each one was performed on some version of Sagitta, Cygnus and Canis. It was all them. It was always them. And I helped to put them up there with that thing, in my own small way. Nobody had answers, at least not ones they were willing to share. One last photograph. Darkness, interrupted only by a horrifying, warm little light. I could feel it looking back at me, radiating malevolence. We never received a transmission from ANTAEUS again. My tour was over. They let me leave. Who would believe me? Who did I have left to tell? Here's the thing. I'm dying. Terminal brain cancer, one of a kind. Doctors say they've never seen anything like it. Reminds them of something they'd see in someone exposed to nuclear waste. Must be why the government used me to take pictures instead of some precious scientist. Before I go, I need someone to carry this burden with me. I don't have answers to everything I saw, every rumor I heard, but I saw enough. It was us that we were studying, the ANTAEUS and her crew, returned to Earth, butchered and broken, and put back together into something new. There were never any aliens. But there is something up there. Something we are watching in secret. Something that hates humanity enough to use the strings of time and space as instruments of torture. And I do know one thing. In every picture, it was getting closer to Earth. It's late. I've had a few, and I can't sleep. Tomorrow's the inquest into the death of my best mate's son. My godchild. An all-round great kid. I've got to be there to give a character statement on Carl, a friend of mine since the first day of school, and his wife, and whether there might have been foul play involved in Noah's death. And honestly, I don't know. I can't stop thinking about it, replaying the story as Carl told it to me. Mostly, I can't stop thinking about the shoes. Everything I know secondhand from Carl. So, I'll tell you what he told me, and maybe you could let me know what you make of it because I just don't know. Carl was a guy I'd have trusted with my life. Last year, he bought a new house with his wife, Suze. It was never in a million years the kind of house I'd imagined Carl buying. An old tumble-down little thing with a thatch roof in the ass end of nowhere, Devon. A beautiful house, no mistaking, with wooden beams, buckets of character, acres of garden to get lost in a village where everyone knows everyone. Nice. Just not very Carl. I can see what drew them though. They needed the space. Noah was fast approaching 8, and his younger brother, Archie, was a 5-year-old wrecking ball. Add a heavily pregnant Suze and a cat into the mix, and London just wasn't an option anymore. I went to visit in their first week after moving. Everywhere was still a mess of boxes, but you could see how happy they all were about the potential for the place. It wasn't without its drawbacks. The floorboards were uneven and groaned under the slightest pressure. The layout was maze-like, and sometimes it felt like there was no knowing where a corridor was leading you before you'd somehow been turned back on yourself. The thick walls made it a Wi-Fi nightmare, and the house didn't warm evenly. In fact, some areas were downright freezing. It was the tail end of a balmy summer, and I'd gone to get some more beers from the garage when I noticed that first cold patch. Hits you in the bones cold. I'd mentioned it to Carl, and he laughed. Yeah, we've noticed them. Never in the same place twice though. You can be walking the house at any time of day or night, and it's like you've walked into the bloody Baltic. Suze nodded in agreement, but she didn't laugh. The weirdest one was the other night. I was the last one up watching Match of the Day. Hadn't shifted from the armchair in a few hours, and it was like the cold spot walked into me. With hindsight, I don't know if any of that is relevant. It was just my first recollection of that house. The first really strange thing happened about 2 days after that. I was helping Carl re-turf the garden while his boys raced around playing a game involving pirates. We'd been working for a few hours when we both noticed the kids' game had stopped, and they were both stood perfectly still, staring down at one of the flower beds. Carl shrugged, and we both went over to see what had paused their game. What struck me first was how oddly still they had both become. They didn't seem to notice the first time Carl asked, "Whose shoes are those?" Noah still had the trowel in his hand. The two of them had been digging in the flower bed, and now, in front of us, was a hole that was nearly 3 feet wide and 1 deep, and filled with shoes. Carl stooped down to pick one up. "This isn't yours, is it?" he asked Noah, brandishing an old black leather shoe with an enormous buckle. Noah shook his head. Of course it wasn't his shoe. It was perhaps the right size for an 8-year-old's foot, but it was far too old to belong to any of them. Carl lifted out another one, shaking the earth that filled it. Another shoe that belonged to a different time. I'm no expert, but it wouldn't have surprised me to find that either of those shoes was more than 100 years old. Carl sent the kids inside, and together we excavated the rest of the flower bed. We found 20 pairs of shoes that day, all of them made for children's feet, each a different style and shape some poor and beaten, some expensive and finessed, and all of them for children. Carl was clearly alarmed, and I could see his eyes start to roam around the rest of the garden, wondering what else might be buried out there. Whatever Carl said about the shoes to Suze was a conversation behind closed doors. That night, we went out to the pub and spent most of the evening reading what Google had to say about children's shoes buried in the garden. The suggestions ranged from the sublime to the ridiculous. Dodgy landfills, serial killer calling cards, plague cleansing, Victorian wards to keep spirits away, fertility rituals. We took turns reading them out while we drank. It had been a good night, and we'd left. But maybe we should have paid more attention. After that, the shoes were kept inside. They made a little display of them, tasseled together on old bits of rope around the fireplace. Suze thought they were quirky. In the months that followed, there were other strange things that Carl would text me about. He said he'd got up around 4 a.m. one night, needing the toilet, and smelt smoke on the way back to the room. He did a once-over of the house and had become convinced that the smell was coming from a freestanding pot plant in the kitchen. It was a little shrub that they'd had for longer than they'd had Noah. After a lot of sniffing, Carl said there was no question it was coming from the plant, and when he pulled it out of the pot, saw that the entire root system was ablaze. Like the soil was full of fluorescent worms. Neither of them had any idea what could have happened, but were relieved they caught it in time, given how flammable all the old timber and thatching was. A week or so later, they found the wasp nest. Suze was cleaning the lounge, trying to sponge out a mark on the wall, when she heard the buzzing. The spot she was sponging gave way completely, revealing a throbbing wasp's nest. Carl sent me a voice message. "Maddest thing, man. Don't know if you've ever seen a wasp nest. They're a bit like beavers apparently, in that they'll carry back all sorts of material to make it. But the nest was bright red and pulsing. Suze thought she found like some kind of organs pulsating in the walls at first, and wouldn't stop screaming that the house was alive. It's messed up. All good though. Exterminators yesterday, and they reckon they've got them all. Just need to keep an eye on it. Weird that nothing came up in the surveys about this though. Not like the solicitors were cheap." Then, the cat went missing. First day that Noah went out to try his new school, he came home calling for George and ran around the whole house. But the cat was nowhere to be seen. Big fat old thing, not prone to long adventures or leaving the house at all really. A London cat that liked its creature comforts. Just gone. They put signs up around the village, and Noah requested that there was some kind of reward for the finder. But it stayed gone. On Halloween, Carl and Suze took the kids trick-or-treating around the village. They were starting to really settle into the village life and getting involved in things that they had never done in London. They come home, swag bags bulging with little chocolates, to find a cat sat on the doorstep outside their house. Not George. Nothing like George. This cat was sleek, lithe, and mean-looking, as Suze put it. But Noah had burst into tears and immediately started hugging and kissing new George, insisting that it had to come inside and that the cat had chosen them. "What are you going to do?" I laughed down the phone. I never had kids of my own, and with the state of my love life, it's doubtful I ever will. Well, Dan, man, I don't know. Obviously, that is someone's cat, isn't it? We can't just have it. I tried to explain this to Noah, and he said that the person can have the cat back when they come for it, and that was a week ago now. I'm just worried no one will come, and we'll be stuck with this new cat who really is a bit of an asshole. We'd laughed, and that was the last time I heard Carl laugh. Maybe we'll never hear Carl laugh, because the next strange thing that happened was that Noah died. Carl said that he'd been sleeping when it happened, but Suze woke him in a blind panic, not knowing exactly what was wrong, but that something had happened. They went to Noah's room first and saw that he was sound asleep in bed, and then went downstairs because they heard a bang. The door to the garden was wide open, and the strange black cat was prowling around near the flower beds. Carl said they never noticed this at the time, probably not until a few days later, but all the shoes around the fireplace were gone. All of Noah's shoes were missing as well. Then they heard a little giggle coming from upstairs, and ran back up to find little Archie sat in the toilet with his trousers around his ankles. "What are you doing, Arch?" Suze had asked. Apparently, happy little Archie pointed down the hallway behind them and said that he wanted to join the daisy line because it looked fun. Neither Carl or Suze understood what this meant. All the kids were arm in arm like a daisy chain, and they went dancing down the corridor. They went in and out of all the rooms, and I missed it because I was in here, and I was laughing because they went into Noah's room and out he came. He got to join the daisy line. Didn't look like he was having fun though. Carl told me that this was when his heart really started to race. He said that a coal patch had settled over them, over the whole corridor. Maybe it was because the leader was so mean. He had such a mean face, even though the dance was fun. He made sure that all the children kept dancing and dancing and dancing, and if they stopped, he whacked their little toes with a sharp stick. Out of all the questions that Carl had wanted to ask, what children, what leader, what on earth are you talking about? All he actually said was, "Noah," before sprinting off down the corridor back to his first child's room. "Maybe we can catch up with all of them in the garden," was the last thing Suze remembers Archie saying from the toilet. Carl tore into Noah's room, and the boy was still lying in bed, just as they'd seen him the first time they'd checked. But this time, Carl went right to his bedside. Sure enough, Noah had no pulse, his little chest no longer rising and falling. A cold patch had settled into the room, and his cold little body, cot death or infant death is what people keep calling it. Noah was really too old for that. But according to the doctors, sometimes these things happen. According to the doctors, this can also be exacerbated by neglect, abuse or trauma from the care providers. So tomorrow is Carl's inquest to see if either him or Suze had a hand in this. And I don't know. They both tell anyone who will listen these stories, these strange happenings in the house, and what Archie had said about the dancing children that night. And everyone smiles and nods at these poor, broken parents and wonders exactly what I'm feeling right now. Was there something else going on? And around this whole mess, I'm trying to help organize Noah's funeral. Sue said that if I looked up in the attic, I'd find his little black suit that they bought him for a wedding a while back, and a little box with some smart black shoes. I found the suit, but the box was empty. And the most messed up thing is I think I know exactly where those shoes are, and I can't bring myself to look. When Sammy got sick, it was like stepping into a dark mirror world. We'd been economically well off, with our 2 full-time jobs and child-free lifestyle, so to suddenly step down to a single income was a wake-up call. Not to mention how the insurance companies managed to weasel out of paying for more than half of Sammy's treatment. Disgusting. Sammy swung for the fences. She took it all in stride. We had our ups and downs with every doctor's visit, but we always ended with taking steps back rather than forward. There was always next time, they said, but we figured we were quickly running out of next times. 1 year down the line, Sammy was on a downward spiral. By then, the catastrophic had turned tragically mundane. I did everything I could to keep her spirit up, but at that point, her light was faded. We barely spoke anymore. A work friend of mine, Barry, was having a bachelor party. He was pulling out all the stops. I was never planning on going, but Sammy insisted I should. "You need to get out of the house for a bit," she smiled. "Do something normal for a while." I protested, but seeing her light up for the first time in weeks was enough to break my guard. She was so happy to see that I still had friends out there. How could I say no? I agreed to be the designated driver. I wouldn't be gone for more than a day, and I'd just be a phone call away. Sammy didn't seem to need that kind of reassurance. It was mostly for me. This was in November. Barry was having a December wedding and wanted all his pals to come along for one big night. Sure, I was just a work friend, but when you're in your mid-30s, you gotta take what you get, friends-wise. And Barry certainly took what he could, inviting no less than 25 people. So, in mid-November, I packed my bags and stepped on board a party bus heading for Annapolis. There were drinks and dinner at the hotel. Then a few hours of losing money on the craps table. I gambled away about $200 at the roulette table, but magically won about $600 playing blackjack. After months of losing battle after battle, it felt good to finally win. I gotta admit, I was getting into it. Not as much as Barry's best man Jake, the guy wearing goggles who spelled out boobs. But hey, that's hard to top. What a legend. Once it became apparent that there'd be no need for a designated driver, I just went along with it. 5 shots of mint schnapps later, I started feeling a bit guilty. I called Sammy, but she laughed it off. "It's good to hear you slur," she said. "You're a fun drunk." Most of the night went by in a blur. More drinks, some dancing, lots of cheering for our main man Barry. Flashing lights, people pulling us back and forth between dance floors, bars, and wandering the streets looking for a taco truck. I clearly remember sitting on a park bench at one point, listening to one of Barry's friends lecture me about roasted seed snacks. Something about antioxidants and digestion. I only remember the noise of it. I ended up back at the hotel. Jake had rented Barry this huge room, and 12 of us had made it all the way there. The after party, and the night was far from over. Because of course, there had to be exotic dancers. I crossed the line by getting completely bass-backwards drunk, but that's about as far as I was willing to go. I gently but firmly declined to partake in any dancing. Instead, I retreated to the back of the room and enjoyed a cigar. Not a habit I'm very proud of, but it's one of those things my old man taught me to appreciate. A good cigar, a whiskey on the rocks. Hell, a man might forget his troubles for a while. Sometime after them replaying Pour Some Sugar on Me for the 6th time, the party was dying down. Some people were heading back to their rooms. Some did so with the company of a dancer. It was a wild night, but like most parties, the music dies, and at 3 in the morning, I was ready to let it. There were only 4 of us left by then: Barry, Jake, some guy named Ramsey, and I. We'd all crashed on a couch, telling stories about our wives, or in Barry's case, his wife-to-be. It was a wild party, but it was clear the guy was in love. Gotta respect that. Then, a stranger walked in. At least 6'7", body like a scarecrow, wore all black except for a white shirt, white hair slicked back and combed. He had the most intense blue eyes I'd ever seen, like he could look straight through me if he wanted to. "I see you gentlemen are enjoying yourselves," he smiled. "I'm guessing the girls didn't disappoint." "They most assuredly did not," hiccuped Jake, "but we're married men here." "Oh, I can tell. If it wasn't for the cigars, all I'd smell in here is virtue." That got a chuckle out of us. Jake introduced him as Tom, or Stranger Tom. Apparently, he was the kind of guy you'd talk to if you wanted to have a good time anywhere from Pasadena to Kent Island. He co-ran several clubs, and he was an enthusiastic movie entrepreneur. I only had to see the colour of his business cards to know exactly what kind of movies he made. Classy stuff. As we started winding down, our discussion drifted into a more philosophical nature. Barry kept saying how much he hoped this marriage would be the one. Jake was worrying about his youngest kid not making it through college. Ramsey was on the verge of crying, talking about his sick dog. And me? Well, I didn't want to say anything. I didn't want to think about real life for a while. Stranger Tom took his feet off the coffee table, spilling an ashtray on the floor. He brought out this intricate silver lighter, engraved with a crow and a pair of sunflowers. "Let's imagine, if you would, that you could get answers to all those questions," he said. "If you could know what things would look like with your wife 20 years down the line, if you could get a hint how to push your boy to the finish line, or how you could find the right person to help your darling pooch make it just a little longer." "Yeah," grinned Barry, finishing the last drop of his drink. "That'd be worth something, wouldn't it?" "Sure would," nodded Jake. "Well, how about it then?" Tom flicked open his lighter, and this steady blue flame shot out. Small, but bright as hell. It didn't flicker. "It'll cost you, but you'll get what you want. Price varies on the scope of the question." "Is this like a party trick, like a Luigi board?" chuckled Jake. The guys laughed. I couldn't hold back a snort myself. Ouija board, Ramsey corrected. Luigi is the Mario guy. Whatever, Tom. Is it like that? Nah, Stranger Tom smiled. I assure you, it ain't nothing like that. His attention turned to me, eyeing me up and down. There was this strange smile on his face, and the man never seemed to blink. Even then, as drunk as I was, I could tell he was creepy as hell. I'm good, I smiled. You guys go ahead. Surely you want to know something good. I looked down at my empty glass. Tom was getting on my nerves. Playing on the worries of drunk people is one of the lowest ways to trick someone out of a cheap buck. Reminded me of a televangelist, but without the promise of paradise. Sure, I nodded. I'm calling you out, Tom. I want you to tell me the colour of my lucky boxers, the ones I wore at my wedding. That's it. Fair enough, said Tom. Now, take a good hard look and just tell me one thing. We all focused on the silver lighter with a little blue flame, unflickering, steady like an oil picture. Do you submit? He asked. We did. It all happened in an instant. This one loud snap, like the choir of carrots breaking in unison. Jake's right arm fragmented in 3 places. I could see bone poking out in different directions, breaking through the skin. Ramsey's jaw snapped and 3 teeth rolled out of his mouth, tapping against the side of the table as they tumbled across the floor. Barry's left leg seemingly exploded, cracking wide open from ankle to hip. And me? A sting on my index finger, nothing more. For a second, there were no screams, just these blank stares as we were drawn into the blue flame. There was no panic, no agony, just realization. Yes, said Jake in perfect clarity. Yes, that's how. She's still beautiful, muttered Barry. Ramsey tried to talk, but ended up slurring with his broken jaw. Blood-mixed spit poured out of the corners of his mouth, along with 2 more teeth. I sat there, looking at these 3 broken men, as Stranger Tom lit a cigarette. It was like 3 puppies who had their strings cut, talking out loud like wind-up dolls. Tom held the lighter aloft, keeping the blue flame bright and steady. He looked me dead in the eye, his smile growing wider. They were red, he said, with little white petals. He closed the lighter, and our collective consciousness went out, along with the blue flame. Waking from a dreamless sleep, I remember screaming. It stank of blood, and I could see dark brown spots across the floor and furniture. There were 2 EMTs giving Barry chest compressions, and someone lifting Jake out of his chair. Ramsey was nowhere to be seen. It was bright outside. Someone was trying to get me out of my chair. Make room, they yelled. Get out. Is he dead? Oh my God, is he dead? I leaned against an unknown hotel staffer as she helped me out of the room. The second I was out, the hangover and shock buckled me over. I hurled all over the carpet. The hallways were covered in confused guests as a flurry of people rushed past me. I only caught a glimpse of Barry's arm. It was white as snow. I had nothing but a bruise on my index finger. It was chaos. EMTs running back and forth, screams in the hallway, in the rooms. Someone just kept yelling, "What's wrong with Barry?" over and over again. My heart was beating so fast that I could barely hear it. Stranger Tom had been absolutely right. My lucky boxes were red with white petals. I got them for my wedding day, and they always managed to bring Sammy a smile. They were just this bright reminder of happier days, so of course they were lucky. But I couldn't stop staring at my index finger. I'd asked a small question and paid a small price. Was it that simple? Was it real? Really real? Barry's fiancée promised to inform us as soon as she heard anything about his condition. One of the other guests offered me a ride home. One by one, we left the town in silence. All the while, I couldn't stop thinking about that tall man with the silver lighter. By the time I got home, Sammy had already heard the news. She hobbled all the way to the front door, almost dropping a cane as she flung herself at me. I wrapped my arms around her, feeling a tinge of ache in my finger. "Thank God you're okay," she sobbed. "They said it was an accident." I didn't want to worry her. She had so much on her mind as it was. "I don't know, honey," I lied, kissing her head. "I was out cold." The next few weeks, I got a lot of updates. Barry had started to recover. Jake was so messed up they had to amputate parts of his lower arm, along with 2 fingers. Ramsey had to drink his dinner for the foreseeable future, but he was doing better. I tried to put it all out of my head. I had more immediate things to deal with, even if that blue flame haunted my nightmares. I sometimes imagined Stranger Tom sitting at the edge of my bed, asking me if there was anything I liked to know. And of course there was. But this madness. There's no such thing as wandering prophets and soothsayers. But when I saw an Instagram post of Ramsey hugging his dog, something ached in my heart. Maybe it was real. Maybe I'd missed a real, actual opportunity. In early December, Sammy took a turn for the worse. Her parents were over every day to help out while I was at work, trying their best to get her to her various appointments. The doctors had all but given up, but were determined to finish the treatment nonetheless. Then came that one day. I'd forgotten about doing laundry and only had a single pair of underwear left. My lucky boxers, red with white petals. Putting them on, even then, brought a smile to Sammy's face. I decided that I wouldn't let the mundane win. I wouldn't wait for the worst to happen. I took time off work and went to see Jake. Jake was still on sick leave for his broken arm. I met him at a cafe downtown, and we got ourselves a couple of bear claws. Without the boobs glasses, he almost looked like a person. We small talked about Barry and Ramsey and how they were doing better. Jake talked about his arm and how the two of us lived through the wildest nights of our lives. Then he took a long look at me. "You really do have red boxers with white petals, don't you?" he asked. "I got a pair, yeah." He nodded, taking another sip of his steaming hot coffee. He looked out the window with a sigh. "My boy is doing better," he said. "Turns out he's got an eye condition. Gave him some migraines." "So he's doing better?" "Night and day," Jake smiled. "It's nothing short of a miracle." There was a pregnant pause as we just nodded at one another, drinking our coffee. Finally, I bit the bullet. "Jake, I'm gonna need the number to Stranger Tom." Jake tried to help as best as he could, but it turns out it wasn't quite that simple. He'd met Tom through a friend of a friend of a friend. Backtracking wasn't as easy as it seemed. Jake gave me the number to a guy who worked at the casino we'd been to. That guy, in turn, directed me to a nightclub manager in Hallithorpe. It took me 2 days of emailing, texting, messaging, and unwanted calls to finally get to a clear lead. A dancer over in Ferndale told me she could set up a meeting with him for a price. It cost me all my blackjack winnings, but I finally had a time and address. Some guy who'd won the lottery and rented out a strip joint. Guess who their host was? It was a Friday night when I drove out there. The place was rented out and closed to the public. I slipped the bouncer a $100 bill, name-dropped the dancer I'd talked to, and promised I wouldn't cause any trouble. That did the trick. The party was going strong. Explosive music, dim red lights, smoke, champagne and sweat. Clinking bottles accompanied by cheers and groans. Not too different from a certain bachelor party. I could almost feel the champagne bubbles tickle my nose. And there, at the bar, sat none other than Stranger Tom. Walking up to him, I felt my heart sink into my stomach. This might be one big Hail Mary, or I could be the dumbest man on the entire East Coast. Tom turned in his seat, sliding a shot of whiskey my way. He didn't even look up. "I knew you'd be back," he said, throwing me a side eye. "You have questions?" "Just one." "It'll have to wait," he smiled. "I got business." He turned to face the partygoers. He raised a glass to them, getting a handful of cheers in return. Tom spoke under his breath, never dropping that unnerving smile. "Clown monkeys." As he turned, those piercing eyes dug deep into me. They seemed different now, stronger, angrier. I could have sworn they moved like fire. "I don't usually let people ask me twice," he said. "Then again, most don't want to." "It's important," I said, "and I'll pay the price." "Oh, I'm well aware. You've come chasing me down. You gotta be hella desperate. Drink your whiskey." "I'm good. I wasn't asking." My heart skipped a beat. I chugged it, letting the liquid fire sink into my throat. My fingers tingled, and I could imagine the ache of my index finger. Just that tinge of pain with promises of more to come. Stranger Tom turned to face the bartender, ordering himself another shot of whiskey. "Who are you?" I asked. "How do you do what you do?" "I'm no one," Tom said. "Who cares?" "So you won't tell me?" He held up his glass, letting the liquid reflect off the coloured lights. Suddenly, his silver lighter was on the table. I never saw him reach for it. It just sort of appeared. "I come from a land of a watchful red sun," Stranger Tom grinned, "where the snow is feathers and the shores are silver black, where all the flowers have choked to death, turning a sickly blue." He tapped his lighter. like my fire. While Tom slipped from table to table, refilling glasses and lighting cigarettes, I stayed at the bar. After a while, it all looked the same. Men, women, dancing, sitting. It was all just meat, sweat and fabric. Wedding rings reflecting the burst from the strobe light, memorial tattoos grinding against exposed chests. My phone buzzed, and I knew it was Sammy. I couldn't bring myself to read it. Long past midnight, I'd fallen asleep at the bar. I woke up as one of the girls wished the bartender a good night. Looking up, I saw Tom waving me over. Most of the place had cleared out. Just a handful of guys left. Tom had the seat of honor at the edge of the table. There were traces of questionable powders right next to puddles of spilled mojitos. "You think there was ever life on Mars?" someone asked. "That's messed up, right? Like, if there was?" "Yeah," another agreed. "Like, all the way over there? What is that even? Like, what does it mean for us?" Stranger Tom gave me a knowing look. "Sounds like you gentlemen are a curious lot," he smiled. "Now, let me present a hypothetical." He gave them the same speech as we'd gotten. Made it sound fun, kind of like a drinking game. Our biggest, deepest questions, all for a spooky little price. A deal with the strip club devil. One guy just asked for the name of whoever stole his pickup. Another tried to be a smartass, asking for the article number of a replacement drip pan for his fridge. They took turns asking these inane, childish nonsense questions, and I just sat there, sweating. Then there was this one guy, this one drunk asshole that chimes in. "I want to know what God looks like," he grins. "Wouldn't you guys like to know that?" "That's a big question," nodded Stranger Tom. "One of the biggest." "Yeah, well, I want to know," the guy repeated. "Don't you guys want to know?" They did. They all did. I tried to chime in, a word here and there, asking them to reconsider or go back to their earlier questions. Hell, I even tried to suggest calling it a night. But it was too late, and Tom had already brought out his lighter. His eyes were brighter now, hungrier. He was thriving. I wanted to do something more, something drastic. If asking what a marriage looks like in 20 years into the future rips your entire leg open, what does asking for the face of God cost? I made a plan in my head. I was going to head for the bathroom, maybe pull the fire alarm, or maybe get everyone a round of drinks stalling for time. But when I saw Stranger Tom's grinning face looking down on me, I knew it was too late. "Don't you want to ask a question too?" he asked. I swallowed my pride, feeling the salt stick to the side of my throat. It burned worse than the whiskey. I nodded. "I want to know how to save my wife." I got a few strange looks from around the table, but Tom just smiled. "That's a big ask," he grinned. "A real big ask." "Can you help?" "Oh, I can," he nodded. "And I'm sure Sammy will be just fine." Looking back at it, I was just too nervous to notice, but I never told him her name. He flicked open his lighter and it lit the blue flame. It felt like the bulbs in the room started to dim, like the music faded away. The static buzzing in the overhead speakers grew louder. "Then look deep into the flame, gentlemen. Look deep and answer me this." His eyes flickered. The flames didn't. "Do you submit?" And they did. I closed my eyes and held my breath, waiting for the pain to come. Seconds passed. Then, a whisper. "I love this part." The man across from me unfurled. That's the best word for it. Unfurled. From his fingertips and up, the very bones of his body started to come undone, like they were escaping his flesh, turning themselves into needles, puncturing him from the inside out. As his skull fractured, twisting his musculature into a parody of a human smile, he started barking nonsensical words, something from a dead language, long since unheard, all with perfect clarity and pronunciation. As his bones broke apart, smattering like a box of firecrackers, whatever he saw was enough to drive him to an eldritch madness in that last moment. To view the face of God. "Eo," he smiled. "Eo, Eo, Eo." Blood and tears streamed down his face. His neck broke in a snap, along with his spine and hip, twisting his body into an impossible shape. The others panicked. One guy fell backwards out of his chair as his body split open on the floor. Another headed for the emergency exit, but didn't even get halfway before his legs burst like popcorn. "Eo, Eo, Eo," they screamed with the last of their wit. One of them crinkled in on himself, like crushing a sheet of paper. One had his ribcage split open, folding him inside out like an empty pocket. "Eo, Eo, Eo." It wasn't a yelp of pain. It was ecstasy. Stranger Tom stood up, soaking it all in. Without turning his eyes from the chanting mounds of broken men, he spoke out loud. "Yours will be worse," he said. "They wanted to see something. You wanted to save a human life. You know what that's worth." He towered over me, his eyes literally crackling with a blue flame. To preserve the infinite potential of a life, the immortal form, created in the image of those who begun. He laughed like it was the best joke he'd ever heard. He laughed until there were tears streaming down his cheeks. "You're going to suffer so many times over." He held up his lighter and put his finger on the lid. "Thank you," he smiled. Click. Images rushed past me. A beach of silvery black, white feathers falling from a clear sky, an endless, waveless ocean, and above, a bloodful, lidless eye, ever peering into the cracks of our being, bending the world, growing larger in my mind, sucking me into a thoughtless everything. Eo, Eo, Eo. And at the end of a breath, the answer was clear to me. I'd had the cure all along. A few weeks down the line, Sammy was going to make a miraculous recovery. After 100 steps backwards, she was finally taking a step forward. It was bound to happen. It was always going to happen. Her hair and smile would grow back, and by spring she'd be sitting next to me, feeding ducks at the pond. And now, I was going to die for nothing. I came to, being held aloft by Stranger Tom. He panted like a hungry dog, his eyes fully blackened, with blue embers flickering impossibly deep in his skull. His eyes had grown sharp and predatory, revealing a white maggot-like tongue. He sneered with anticipation, staring into me. "No," I stammered. "No, it's not." The last chance of Eo had died, reduced to a single wheezing cough from the final man with something that could resemble a face. Stranger Tom's smile faded. He turned his head to one side, frowning. You're not going to save her, are you?" "No, she's going to make it, on her own." "God damn it." He grasped my neck with one hand and threw me to the floor. I tried to fight him off, but it was like pushing on an oak. "I was looking forward to that one. I'm aching for it," he groaned. "And I get nothing? Just let..." "No," he spat. "I'm not getting much, but I'm going to savor this." He let me go and stepped back. 100 thoughts rushed through my head. Pleading, cursing, crying, screaming. It all just turned into this whining noise, meaning nothing and everything at once. Tom bore down on me, furious. "Give me what you owe." Then, a crack. And darkness. People tell me the place went up in flames. I think he set the fire, possibly to cover the tracks. It was easy enough to blame the partygoers. They didn't particularly care for fire safety. I remember swirling smoke moving overhead as someone dragged me by the legs. In that moment, that infinite second between life and death, I could see it. That big red eye in the sky peering down at us, infinitely far and away and enveloping us at the same time. Eo, Eo, Eo. For those who ask, I was just going to a party I'd been invited to. That's the official story. There was a fire and a beam fell, gave me a minor spinal fracture and knocked me out cold. Few know that the fracture came long before the fire. The most magical irony of this whole story was just a few months ago. I was in bed, waiting for the pain meds to kick in, and Sammy was waiting for me by the door. "Can't sleep all day," she smiled. "We've got ducks to feed." I wanted to share this in the faint hope that it prevents a tragedy to someone, somewhere. He's still out there, lurking at the edge of parties, listening in on drunken songs, waiting for his time to strike. When that lapse of judgment is just right. It really makes sense for the most basic advice to help us, even now, to never, ever talk to strangers. I used to work stocking shelves at a grocery store. It wasn't all that bad, but every now and then, you'd get some annoying customers that bother you. I like helping people, but it sucks when someone does something like insisting you totally actually have something in stock when you don't, or when someone yells at you because someone else dropped something. Stuff like that. But the strangest customer I've had to deal with made me quit my job. Made me a little afraid to be around people at all. It was a day like any other, I guess. there was nothing that suggested it was going to be any different from any other mildly monotonous shift. I was in the latter half of my shift, the point where it's not quite close to time to go home yet, around when I usually start to zone out. I was in the far corner that is usually pretty quiet, stocking one of the ends of the aisles with a soup that was on special. Behind me was a little area kind of separated from the main area. General merchandise. That's where we keep all the random crap like kitchen stuff, pool toys, and the holiday stuff. This clean-shaven guy with a brown buzz cut walked up to me and asked, "Where's the ketchup, buddy?" He was pretty tall, probably close to 7 feet. The guy had a really square jaw. He looked a little rough but friendly at the same time. Just your average dude. He kinda struck me as a father. Just something about him, I dunno. His blue eyes had this look to them, like he could have cracked into a joke on a moment's notice. Probably a pretty crude one. My first impression of this guy is important, considering what happened afterwards. I had to shake myself awake a little as I answered him. "In aisle 15. He winked and gave me a thumbs up. "Thanks, buddy. You're a lifesaver." I smiled and went back to stocking the shelves and saw him wander off into aisle 15 in the corner of my eyes. A few minutes later, after I finished putting the first box on the shelf and went to take the next one off my cart, I saw the same guy was standing close by, looking down at me with this weird expression on his face. Embarrassment, I guessed. Then, he smiled again. "Where's the ketchup, buddy?" I blinked. He shifted around a bit. Did he forget the aisle? Could he not find it? Or maybe we were just out of ketchup, though I doubted it. Whatever. It was no big deal, obviously. He must have been thinking about something else and forgot. Nothing to be embarrassed about. I pointed the aisle out to him that time. "Aisle 15. He winked and gave me another thumbs up. "Thanks, buddy. You're a lifesaver." And he went to wander down the aisle. I laughed. He stopped and turned back to me just as he was about to turn the corner, and he gave me this mildly perturbed look. I closed my mouth, and then he went down the aisle, kind of stomping off. I didn't mean to be rude by laughing, and I thought he was having a laugh about it too. A minute later, I saw him going to the checkout with a girl. His wife, I assumed. In another 5 minutes or so, I'd finished stocking that shelf end, so I started to bring the cart out back and load up to restock the sparkling water. When I got to the other end of the aisle, the same guy was standing there, looking the other way. He seemed totally lost. He turned his head around and caught me in the corner of his eyes, recollection flashing in them. He wasn't holding anything and didn't have a cart. "Didn't find the ketchup?" I asked him politely. He smiles, nods. "Where's the ketchup, buddy?" I can't help blurting out a little laugh. Scratching my head, I wondered if he was messing with me, or maybe he was high. He had sounded exactly the same as the other times he asked it, almost like he was playing a recording instead of speaking. I decided to show him directly where the ketchup was. "Are we out?" I asked. The guy's smile quivered a little. Maybe he really couldn't find it. "Here, I'll show you where it is." I started walking down the aisle, and sure enough, I could see the ketchup from where I was. The guy blinked and watched me, but he didn't move. This way. I motioned down the aisle. His eyes widened a little, like I was speaking in a foreign language or something. Then, after hesitating, he stumbled after me. His demeanor had suddenly seemed so different from his confident appearance. He came after me, shyly, like a lost child, while I stood in front of the ketchup. The shelf was pretty much full, and if I'm being honest, there's no way someone could have overlooked it unless they were blind or under the influence. I stood by it, and he kept walking until he stopped with a jolt right up next to me, like he didn't understand why I had stopped. He eyed me expectantly until he opened his mouth to say something. Then his lower lip trembled and he shut his mouth again. Right there, sir. I pointed to the ketchup bottles. He blinked a few times, looked harder at me, like he was trying to calculate 50 math equation problems in his head, scanned down my body, and rested his eyes on my pointing finger. It's needless to say, it was a really awkward situation. The ketchup is there, I stammered out. His eyes suddenly lit up like he had won the lottery. His dilated pupils shrunk. Then he smiled and nodded vigorously. Thanks, buddy, you're a lifesaver. And he gave me the same thumbs up. I laughed sheepishly. Yeah, happens to the best of us. No worries. I wander awkwardly back to my cart, turning back to see him smiling contently at the ketchup. I loaded some of the sparkling water onto my cart, but the raspy voice of Greg, the manager, stopped me. No, John. He came out from behind one of the loaded pallets. He's pretty short, so I didn't see him at first. Bring a pallet of the toilet paper that's on sale out by the general merchandise. Aye aye, Captain. Greg laughed, though it sounded more like he was choking. I swear the guy smokes at least 2 packs a day, and I wouldn't be surprised if it was 3. I got the pallet ready to take out and started hauling it out towards the doors with the pallet jack. There was someone standing at the doors, probably about to go inside, but they retreated out from behind the plastic window as I approached, and I inwardly thanked them, since it's kind of hard to stop pulling a pallet once you get it going. I pushed myself through the plastic doors, and someone laughed right next to me as I came out. I thought it was Greg, but I didn't see him go out ahead of me. It didn't sound quite like him either, just a little different, like someone was mocking him. I turned to the source and saw someone a lot taller than Greg standing there. It was the ketchup guy. He was there, smiling. He laughed again, doing his best impression of Greg's laugh. Then he spoke. Bring a pallet out by general merchandise. He made his voice raspy, just like Greg's. I didn't realize it then, but he was bending down a little bit. I just stared at him, taken aback, not really sure what he was up to. Then I kind of half-heartedly smiled, thinking that maybe he knew Greg, or maybe he was just mocking him. I laughed. Yeah, he must know Greg, I thought. He laughed again, sounding almost exactly like the grating chuckle I heard out back from my manager. He scrunched up a bit more, coming under my height. Still not sure how to react, I laughed uneasily and walked away. The guy called out again. bring a pallet out by general merchandise. I said something in response, maybe good one or something, I can't remember, and rushed briskly towards general merchandise. I just brushed the whole thing off as some weird joke, and I had to get my work done. It was a pretty long day by then. Up until that point, I've had run-ins with stranger people. As I put the pallet in place, this young guy with a goatee and glasses came up to me. "Excuse me, where's the washroom?" He had a British accent. I pointed it out to him. "It's just around the corner from merchandise." He ran off, and I noticed he had a bit of a limp with his right leg. He disappeared around the corner, running. I guess he really needed to go. I heard his heavy footfalls clack as he rushed to the door out of view, and at the same time, another set of footsteps approached from one of the aisles, strangely similar. The sound of someone's unique footsteps isn't something I really ever paid attention to at all before, but with his limp, they were so distinct. I half expected the guy that just went around the corner to somehow come from the aisle and ask me where the bathroom was again. But it was the damn ketchup guy again. He rushed right up to me. "Excuse me, where's the washroom?" I raised an eyebrow. He had said it in a British accent, mocking the guy. When I didn't laugh or respond immediately, he looked around with a strange look. At the time, I thought he was embarrassed I didn't laugh. Whatever he was doing, I didn't find it funny. "Sir," I tried to be polite with him. "I don't know what you're doing, but I'm just trying to do my job, okay?" His eyes widened. He looked like he was going to cry. My other eyebrow was raised. What was up with this guy? He looked around frantically. "Excuse me, where's the washroom?" I thought he was genuinely asking for a second, but he still said it in his mock British accent. He had to be messing with me, but his body language and facial expression suggested otherwise. Sighing and shrugging, I pointed towards the washroom. He nodded, assured but still panicky, and rushed off around the corner. He ran with the same limp the British guy had. Before he rounded the corner, he turned back at me for just an instant. I couldn't read his expression. Shrugging to myself and shaking my head, I took the pallet jack from under the pallet. When I heard a shout come from around the corner. "Good day, young man," an old lady greeted me as she passed by. I nodded to her, still looking in the direction of the corner. "Would you know where I could find the butter?" she asked me. I turned away from the corner, cleared my throat. Just down aisle 17, right there." "Oh, and one more thing," she nodded and continued, while I glanced back towards the corner, a shiver running down my spine. Two eyes peered at me from around the corner. My own eyes widened, but the two that looked back at me seemed to be filled with even more terror than mine. Someone was watching from around the corner, and as the lady spoke, his mouth moved. He was mouthing the same thing she was saying. "The cake mix, do you know where it is?" "Aisle 12, I muttered. That wasn't where it was, but my mind was elsewhere. It was gripped by the twisted and gnarled hand of the uncanny. My stare remained locked with the panic-shifting eyes of that man that watched us in terror as he whispered the same response as the old lady. Thank you very much." The old lady wandered off, and immediately after, the ketchup man rushed from around the corner, his neck bent down in a hunch like the old lady, sweating profusely. I already knew what was coming, but it still didn't make it any less completely bizarre. "Good day, young man," he cooed in the old lady's voice. My eyes twitched. It was an imitation, like a parrot repeating human speech. But it was pretty damn close to the old lady's voice. That grip on my brain tightened, squeezed. It had to be a prank, but there's no way that it was. Someone pulling a prank wouldn't look like that, wouldn't be shivering. He seemed just as shocked as me. He was on the verge of tears. Genuine, pure, stark anxiety was displayed clearly on his face. I didn't know what to feel. An emotion I still don't understand racked my body. I shuddered, and the man trembled. His neck twitched like the nerves inside of them were readjusting. Or maybe it was just his vocal cords. And then, "Would you know where I could find the butter?" he asked me in the old lady's voice. It wasn't like before. It didn't sound like a bad impression anymore, or like it was an impression at all. It was the old lady's voice. My jaw hung loose, and he seemed composed for half a second before he trembled again, bit his lip. I couldn't tell which of us was more horrified. It didn't make any sense. My mind tried to process why he could be doing what he was doing. When I didn't respond, he stuttered, stammered out some gibberish with the same intonations as the old lady, and then an announcement came over the speakers. A female voice. "Porter to aisle 8 for a wet clean-up." The guy looked straight, opened his mouth, let it hang, gurgled, and then he repeated the announcement. But he didn't just say it. He repeated it exactly as it had been played by the speaker. His voice had the slight mechanical tint to it that a voice coming out of a speaker did. He said it in the woman's voice. He looked down at me, smiled with wide eyes. I shouted out something at him. It was a purely visceral reaction. There wasn't any sense to it. My mind overwhelmed and recoiling from something it couldn't process. "I don't know what the hell you're doing, but please, leave me alone." He jumped back when I shouted, brought his hands up like I was going to hit him. Tears pattered against the floor. The guy was crying. He started sobbing. His whole body was shaking like he was having a seizure, and he muttered, "Excuse me, where's the washroom?" in the British accent of the guy that had originally asked me the question. I looked around. Nobody else was nearby. I didn't know what to do. Who the hell in my situation would know how to respond to something like that? It was so far removed from human behavior. I could only stare. Beneath my stare, he sobbed something out. "Hey buddy," and cut himself off, his voice trailing into Greg's rough laugh, and he ran away, his back hunched over, his right leg limping. He rushed into the general merchandise area, going behind one of the shelves. I don't know what I would have done if I was still alone then, but someone spoke next to me, a raspy voice. "What's going on here?" It was Greg. It was actually him, and not just the guy mimicking his voice. I don't know what I told Greg. I sputtered out a fractured 10-second version of what had happened, still overcome with confusion and horror, and I don't know what else. I pointed to the shelf the guy had run behind, and there were his 2 eyes watching us. I had goosebumps over my whole body, felt an indescribable feeling in my gut. Everything about it was wrong. Greg stared and muttered, "What the hell?" The thing whispered it back. Greg went into general merchandise, approached the guy. The guy looked like he wanted to run and hide, but as Greg asked him what he was doing and he mouthed it back, the guy came out from around the corner, squatting to Greg's level. "What are you doing?" The guy tilted his head at Greg as he repeated him, backing up, retreating like a cornered rabbit. Greg's eyes narrowed. I followed after him. I don't know why. I felt like something awful was about to happen. And I was right. In the general merchandise area, there's this really loud air conditioner in the corner. Greg had the guy backed up to it. Greg's a pretty no BS kind of guy, so when the thing started repeating him, he wasn't having it. "Listen, buddy, I don't know what you're doing, but I'm afraid I'm going to have to ask you to leave." The guy was crying again. He laughed in Greg's laugh. "What the hell?" And then, as he brushed against the air conditioner, the guy's eyes widened so much I thought they would pop out of his skull. He straightened like he'd been suddenly electrocuted. And he screamed. He screamed with many voices and tones all at once, like there was a whole crowd trapped inside of his throat, and it echoed through the whole damn building. Greg backed up. I stood stock still. The guy had fallen to his knees. He brought his hands up to cover his face and sobbed. And the whole time he sobbed, he kept speaking in different voices, repeating the same things that he had repeated to me. "Where's the ketchup, buddy? Good day, young man. Bring a pallet out by general merchandise." Greg's laughter mixed with his own sobbing. "Thanks, buddy. You're a lifesaver." He brought one of his hands away from his face. It trembled in front of him, and he slowly formed it into a thumbs up. Then he laughed in Greg's laugh again, and started scratching at his throat with his other hand, still keeping the thumbs up. He fell face first on the floor, and curled up into the fetal position. By then, a few people had come over to see what was going on. I heard shocked gasps around me, but I didn't avert my eyes. He kept repeating the same sentences again and again and again, sometimes mixing up the voices. The whole time, he was crying. Greg uttered to me that he was going to get security. I said something incomprehensible and kept watching. I remember having a strange thought then. Scrunched up there, he looked just like a fetus torn out of the womb too early. Then the guy went stiff as a board, looked straight up at the ceiling with a deadpan expression, and he started humming. He was making the same sound as the loud air conditioner. It didn't sound like a person trying to make a mechanical sound. It sounded identical, like an echo. His whole face and neck were twitching and writhing around like it was melting, boiling, or like something was inside of it, trying to pry his own face off. He did that for about 30 seconds before looking up at me. Pure despair in his eyes. "Please." He said it in my voice, exactly my voice. I gasped out something, and my bewilderment seemed to send him even further over the edge. He leaped up, hunched over, and limped past me as fast as he could, rushing out towards the entrance. I watched him leave. Maybe I should have done something, but I was too utterly shocked to do anything but stare when it had happened. And even if I could move, what could I have done? Greg came back with the security guard. I didn't tell them the whole story, just said the guy ran off. They laughed it off. Greg let me take a break after that. I didn't say anything to anyone the rest of the day, and I quit my job that night. I don't go to grocery stores anymore, and I try to avoid strangers as much as possible. Whenever someone opens their mouth, I almost expect them to start acting like that. I don't know what happened to that man, or what he was. If he was even human or what, I don't know. I just don't know. The following are extracts from the diary of my great-great-granduncle who served in the United States Marine Corps during the Philippine-American War. Doing research on him, his records say he was dishonorably discharged from the Marine Corps due to drunkenness. Reading through these entries, I think I understand why he turned to the bottle during his last year in service. I can still remember the baby's cries. I can still remember the sight of the mother going around the village carrying her injured child, begging for help. The baby was a goner. We all knew that. With one arm ripped off by a bullet and blood spilling everywhere, it was a miracle that the baby still had enough energy to cry. The baby was strong, I gotta hand that to him, but no strength was enough to save him. The bullet that struck him was a stray one, fired from an insurrecto from the jungle during the first attack they made since our arrival the day prior. It occurred early today, at dawn, while most of us and the villagers were still asleep. Firing wildly at the village, the insurgents' volleys managed to miss our pickets, as well as us Marines sleeping in the flimsy huts that passed off as our barracks. We were lucky, but the kid was not. Moments after his mother searched the village for help, the baby's crying stopped. I feel sorry for the poor kid and mother, but there was nothing that could be done. They were simply unlucky. A funeral is to be held tomorrow, and the captain wanted some of us Marines to help in the ceremony. We hope to show the villagers that we were on their side and win their respect by assisting in their traditions. However, the village suggested that it would be best for us to stay away from the funeral. He told the captain that the mother and some of her relatives were angry at us, blaming us for her child's death. She thinks that if we weren't here in the village, then the insurrectos would never have attacked and fired that bullet that killed a child. The village leader feared that our presence in the funeral would have caused some sort of fight between us and the family. Hearing this frustrated the captain, but he relented, although not before muttering how ungrateful the locals were for the protection we were giving them against the wandering ladrones. So far, it seems that our stay here has started out badly. I was out at the picket line last night when I heard movement in front of me. Just behind some bushes, there was someone there. Immediately, I pointed the rifle towards the direction of the noise and fired. No one was supposed to be outside the village at this time, so it meant any native out at that time was most likely an insurrecto. Almost immediately, my shot alerted the other pickets and the Marines back at the village. From behind me, I could hear officers and NCOs waking sleeping Marines and ordering them to their respective outposts. Soon enough, I heard the sergeants calling out to us on the picket line, ordering us to get back and rejoin our respective sections. I wasted no time at running back towards the village to take up my position at my assigned outpost. However, as I made my way back, I noticed a lack of fire coming from the jungle. This quickly told me that no attack was coming. For a moment I feared I may have caused a false alarm, but I knew what I heard. There had been movement right in front of me. This insistence, however, did little to stop the annoyed remarks from the others, who complained that I woke them up for nothing. We spent the rest of the night restlessly waiting for an attack that never came. Despite the lack of an insurgent attack, I was ultimately proven right that I did indeed hear movement. The first patrol of the day inspected the area I said I fired my shot towards and found that there was a body there. However, I'm not proud that my bullet found its mark, because the one I struck down was a woman. To be specific, it was the woman who lost the baby during the insurgent attack. We were all confused on why she was outside the village that night. To make things even more confusing, it was later found out that she had dug out her child's grave, leaving it empty. The officers speculated that the woman was planning to join her husband, who was an insurrecto, and that she brought a dead child with her so that they could bury him in the mountains. I'm not fully convinced by this. One of my friends, who was on the patrol that saw her body, told me that she fell in a way that looked like she was going back to the village, not away from it. He also said that her clothes and feet were muddy, as if she had just come back from the mountains. This, combined with the fact that they couldn't find the corpse of a child with her when she fell, tells me that she went to the mountains with the body and came back without it. I don't know what this all means, but it makes me feel uneasy thinking about it. Garrison life in this village has been peaceful these last couple of days. Compared to the last fishing village we were assigned to protect, where we were attacked almost nightly, our stay out here has been calm, with no insurgent attacks occurring after the first encounter we had with them. Most of the boys are happy about this, but I personally find it strange. These islands are filled with angry natives who want nothing more than for us to leave. So to find a little corner of these islands that just so happens to have passive insurrectos just feels wrong. I'm not the only one to think that this is strange, as the captain has been restless these past couple of days, wondering why the insurrectos have been so quiet. At first he thought that the enemy was taking their time, choosing to observe us from a distance so that they could gather their strength and make a plan before springing their attack. He says that an army garrison on another island had stayed in a village that they thought was peaceful, but once their guard was down, the insurrectos and the villagers rose up and massacred each one of them. He doesn't want us Marines to meet the same fate, so he increased security at our little outpost, doubling patrols around the village and making sure that there were always 2 Marines guarding our barracks at night. However, our patrols of the surrounding jungle confused us more, as they seemed to show that there had been no recent insurgent activity near the village. Normally, footprints of insurrecto scouts would be found at the village outskirts, but here, there were none. So this either means the insurrectos here were better at covering their tracks, or that they're just not trying at all. If it was the latter, then why? It didn't seem like them to leave one of our garrisons untouched or unobserved. Lieutenant Miller, one of the glory hunting officers of the company, believes the lack of insurgent activity reveals that the enemy is weak in this area. He thinks that the insurrectos in charge of these parts are either few in number, few in weapon, sick with dysentery, or all of the three. Because of this, he believes that it's the perfect time to strike before the insurgents could resolve their issues. Rumor is that he suggested to the captain that a strong expedition should be sent out to hunt for the insurgent camp and eliminate them. I can't say I approve of this idea, but that's just because there's a high chance that the captain will task Lieutenant Miller with such an operation. With me being part of his platoon, then that means I would end up marching through the hot and muddy jungle deep within insurrecto country, praying that none of those feral natives was hiding behind the thickets with a rifle pointed at me. Patrolling the nearby jungle outskirts of the village was already bad enough, but heading straight to enemy territory definitely brings higher risk. I would rather be stuck here doing menial tasks such as watching the villagers plant rice or inspecting their fishing boats for contraband, than go out there actively hunting for them. Our platoon started the march early in the day, just before the sun rose. Lieutenant Miller, flanked by our trusted native scout and a local villager we coerced to guide us through the jungle paths, led the way. Who is said to be the brother of one of the insurrectos here, marched in front of the lieutenant to make sure that the enemy would be hesitant at firing a volley at our officer. Our goal was to reach the stream located a few miles away from the village. Our native scout had extracted information from one of the villagers that such a stream existed and may be used by the insurrectos as their water source out there in the jungle. Lieutenant Miller hoped to search the area around the stream and locate the insurgent camp. As expected, the march was difficult, with narrow, slippery paths all along the way. Things only got worse once the sun rose up, as it added uncomfortable heat to our already laborious tasks. A few hours into our march, every single Marine had their uniforms soaking in sweat. The only good thing about the march was that we weren't harassed by the insurrectos. We took a couple of quick breaks along the way, but eventually, at around midday, we reached the stream. Making sure that the area was clear, we took another quick break to regain our energy and refill our canteens before beginning the search for the insurgent camp. Splitting up into 3 sections, I ended up being the one led by the lieutenant himself. Deciding to go upstream, he led us along rocky terrain flanked by thick jungle. With every step, I feared that the insurrectos would ambush us. We kept quiet as we made our way, trying to listen to our surroundings while looking for any sign of the enemy. I don't remember how long it took, but we eventually found something. It was not what any of us were expecting. Laying by the stream was a native, unmoving and lifeless. From what I initially saw, I noticed that his clothes were stained in blood. Cautiously, we approached, wondering if this was an ambush. However, after a few minutes of silence, Lieutenant Miller decided to move up towards the laying native. We followed close behind him. Once the lieutenant stood by the body, a sergeant divided us, with one group led by the sergeant spreading out to form a picket around the area, while the other group stayed by the lieutenant. The fallen native was an insurrecto. There was no doubt about that. With him being deep in the jungle, and with a revolver nearby him, we knew that he was our enemy. But the way he died is what attracted our curiosity. Being there next to Lieutenant Miller, I saw the native's clothes and skin had tear and scratch marks, while his stomach was gutted open, entrails chewed on and spread all over. To me, it seemed like some wild animal with sharp claws and teeth attacked him and began opening his stomach and eating his internal organs. It was a gruesome sight, and I had to do my best to keep my composure as I stood there. We all thought that the Insurrecto was attacked by a jungle animal. What animal it was, we weren't sure, but I feared we could be its next victim. For a moment, I gave a short prayer, hoping that whatever animal that attacked him was no longer hungry. We stayed there for a while, debating amongst ourselves what type of animal could have done that to the Insurrecto, when the sergeant who informed the picket line called out to the lieutenant. "Sir, one of my men found the enemy camp," he called out. "It's just behind the bushes, over here." With that, everyone quickly drew out our rifles and double-timed towards the sergeant. Positioning ourselves behind a thick wall of bushes, we peered through the leaves and saw a clearing. On that clearing was a small camp, with huts, some scattered crates and sacks, and, to our surprise, deceased Insurrectos. Cautiously moving forward and out of the bushes, we entered the enemy camp and searched the place. There was no one there, only us and the dead. Counting the bodies, we saw at least 30, all dead. Inspecting their corpses, we noted that they suffered the same fate as the Insurrecto by the stream. Like him, their clothing and skin had tear marks and scratches, while their stomachs ripped open and guts chewed on. This scared us all, and I even saw the normally unfazed Lieutenant Miller give worried glances toward the number of dead and gutted Insurrectos on the jungle floor. Nothing there made sense, and we began to question if it was possible for an animal or even a group of animals to do such a thing. Clearly these men were armed, and clearly they had tried fighting off whatever attacked them, as empty cases littered the ground. Yet, despite their efforts, they were still massacred. Not feeling secure with the few men he had there, Lieutenant Miller ordered one Marine to contact the other two sections and have them regroup with us. Meanwhile, the rest of us Marines remained at the camp and took up defensive positions in case a different group of Insurrectos came by to retake the camp. As I stood watch at one section of the camp, I could hear Lieutenant Miller and the sergeant talk behind me. "Do you really think animals did this?" the lieutenant asked. "Well, sir, it's the only possible answer," I heard the sergeant respond. "It reminds me of a bear attack back home. Now, I'm not saying it was a bear that did this. Hell, I'm not sure if they have bears here on this godforsaken island, but it's what it reminds me of." Whatever the lieutenant was going to say in response was suddenly drowned out by the chilling cry of a baby. Turning my attention towards the cry, I quickly realized that it was coming from the piece of jungle ahead of me. Acting on instinct, I quickly raised my rifle towards the direction, but withheld my fire. Soon, the lieutenant and sergeant moved closer towards me, until the two were flanking me as they gazed towards the jungle. For a moment, we all remained silent as we listened to the cry of the baby. It sounded nearby, probably only a few yards away. However, due to the thickness of the jungle, it was impossible to see where the source was. Many questions plagued my mind at that moment. Why was there a baby deep within the jungle? Was it alone? Was this a trap being set up by the insurgents? I'm sure the lieutenant was wondering the same thing, as he took his time thinking how he should respond to the situation. I'm not exactly sure what went on inside his head, but him being a glory-seeking character, he probably thought that it would look good for him to investigate the source of the cry and, if the baby was found, save it. The image of us Marines saving a native baby from the clutches of the insurrectos would work well for our relations with the villagers, and the lieutenant probably thought that the captain would praise him for such a success. I believe that was what the lieutenant was thinking when he ordered us to follow him, leaving behind only 3 Marines to remain at the clearing to secure it and await the others. The lieutenant led the way, pushing his way through the jungle. I followed close behind him, with the rest of the boys behind me and the sergeant at the rear of our column. There seemed to be no path towards the source of the crying, so the lieutenant was forced to improvise and cut through the foliage with a native bolo knife he always brought with him. Eventually, the sound of crying grew louder and louder, further encouraging the lieutenant as he worked harder to get through the jungle. Staying close behind him, scanning ahead to make sure that the ground ahead of the lieutenant was safe, I couldn't help but notice something as the crying echoed in my ears. The cry sounded familiar. I know that the cries of babies often sound the same, but this one sounded so familiar. It reminded me of the cry of the baby that was struck by an insurrecto's bullet, the one who died earlier this week. The thought of that brought a chill through my bones. As the sound of crying drew closer, the lieutenant eventually reached the piece of flat ground. Shoving aside some large leaves, he soon gave out a victorious shout as he pointed ahead of him. Looking past him, I soon saw a baby on the ground, laying on dirt, crying as it lay there. However, as I got a good glimpse of the child, I felt my body stiffen in fear. The baby was missing most of its arm. It looked as if the rest of its arm was torn off or shot off. A mixture of panic and fear filled me during that moment. As ridiculous as it seemed, I thought that it was the baby that had been killed at the village. But it was impossible. The baby was gone. So who was this right in front of us? Who was this baby that looked exactly like it? After scanning the area to make sure it was safe, the lieutenant slowly kneeled and prepared to pick up the baby. Standing just behind him, I clutched my rifle firmly in my hands as I felt a sense of unease. Watching the lieutenant turn towards me, I saw the baby cradled in his hands as he ordered us back to the clearing. However, as he was about to step forward and lead the way once more, the baby began to peel its skin. Right before my eyes, the skin of the baby began to peel off like a snake. Eyes wide in fear, I fixated on it as the skin separated to reveal a second layer underneath, one covered in wrinkles. At that moment, the lieutenant noticed my reaction and looked down at the baby to be surprised at what he saw. In reaction, he nearly dropped it, but the baby moved quickly as its one complete arm suddenly grabbed him by the neck. The grasp must have been strong, because I could hear the lieutenant begin to choke. Losing air, he fell on the ground as he desperately tried to pull the baby off of him. Shaking off my initial shock, I moved toward the lieutenant and, after dropping my rifle, tried to pull on the baby who was grasping tightly on his neck. However, my hands only managed to hold on to its peeling skin. When I pulled, I ended up pulling his outer skin, completely removing it and revealing fully what was under. It was no baby. It was a monster. Hiding behind an innocent toddler's skin was a creature that I could only describe as a wrinkly beast with dry skin, pointy ears, bloodshot eyes, and disproportionate legs. It was ugly and small. Yet, although its size was that of a baby, its hands had long claws, while its mouth had teeth as sharp as a bayonet. It looked deadly, and it quickly proved that when it tore into the lieutenant's neck with its teeth. Going wild, it used its teeth and claws to ravage the lieutenant, as he was helpless to fight it off. Soon enough, he stopped struggling, but this creature continued to tear through his body, moving his attention away from its neck and switching its focus to his stomach, which it tore open with ease. Backing away quickly, I soon realized that the rest of the boys had their rifles trained on the creature, but none of them fired. Even the sergeant just stood there, unable to give orders. I'm not sure if it was because of the shock of what they saw or the fear of hitting the lieutenant earlier as he struggled, but whichever it was, none of them fired, and now the lieutenant was dead, body being consumed by a creature of nightmares. As the sound of the creature snarling and tearing through flesh echoed in the jungle. For a moment, it remained like that. Then, the sound of babies crying erupted from above us. Looking up at the trees over our heads, I saw a dozen of those terrible creatures hanging on the branches, staring at us with hungry, bloodshot eyes. What occurred next happened so fast, and I remember myself screaming as creatures jumped on us and fell on top of many of the boys. I don't know how I got lucky, but I managed to avoid one from dropping directly on top of me. Instead, he fell hard on the ground. Before I could recover, I gave it a hard kick, sending it flying towards a nearby tree. Looking around, I saw men fighting for their lives, struggling to fend off the creatures that were clawing and gnawing on them. Remembering what happened to the lieutenant, and realizing that there was no way to get that creature off once it was on you, I decided not to stay any longer. Dashing away, I did my best to follow the path we made, as I moved as fast as I could back towards the clearing. Behind me, I could hear the tortured screams of men, as they mixed with the hellish growls of those demonic creatures. I don't remember how long I ran and tumbled through the jungle, but eventually I reached the clearing. To my relief, the rest of the platoon was now there. Familiar faces greeted me and asked me where the lieutenant and the rest of my section was, but I couldn't reply. Instead, exhaustion overtook me, and I collapsed. Next thing I remember, I was back in the village, inside one of the huts we used as a field hospital. I was safe now. I later learned that out of all of the men in my section, I was the only one that survived. The captain asked me what had happened, and I told him what I remembered, but he gave me a strange look, and I knew that he didn't believe me. I can't blame him. I wouldn't have believed my story either if I didn't see it with my own eyes. I have few friends left here. Most think I have lost my mind due to the encounter. Talk among the company says that many think that the lieutenant and the rest of my section were ambushed by insurrectos and badly butchered by them in an attempt to send us a horrific message. From what I hear, they'll soon be shipping me out of here. Johnny, one of my few friends I have left in the company says the captain has written me off as unfit for combat. They'll probably end up sending me to the garrison at Cavite, where it's much quieter. As much as I hate leaving my unit behind, I'm happy to get away from this place and the horrors contained within its jungles. A few months ago, the civil township of Wanley, North Carolina, was officially revoked. The areas had a dwindling population for decades, and with less than a dozen people living there as of writing this, the town has been absorbed into the neighbouring area. For most people, this is a footnote. No one really knew about Wanley. Hell, even the post office got confused at times. But that town used to be something, and the people who came from there are as real as it gets. I was one of those people. And I want to tell the story of what happened. In the 90s, Wanley was home to approximately 3,800 people. The main export was corrugated steel roofing sheds produced by the Wanley Metalworking Roofing and Tiles. There were 2 dairy farms, the Ansons and the Bows. We also had a small barley and wheat refinery, a high school, 2 large off-site admin offices, and one of those small-scale business incubators. Apart from that, there wasn't much to see in Wanley. Just this flat chunk of land amid a big pile of nothing. In those days, people were already leaving town. Businesses were split between Rayetteville and Roseboro. A lot of people figured that there was no point making big investment plans for a town that was bleeding out. Hell, even Wanley Metalworking considered relocating south to Wilmington, abandoning their namesake. But despite all that sour gloom, it was an industry decisions that caused the downfall of Wanley. I was 13 years old in 1993. I grew up with my mom, Ranielle, Rani for short, and my dad, Morgan. My little brother, Amos, had the room right across the hall. He was just 10 years old at the time. It was the last month of middle school. The following autumn, I was supposed to study at Wanley High, but for all of primary school, we had to take the bus out of town. It took us about 25 minutes one way. Not too bad, but it singled us out. Us Wanley kids were a unit at that point, arriving and leaving in unison. It was a Friday afternoon in late May. I was on the school bus, on my way back home. There were these 2 kids in front of me who couldn't stop talking about their latest Super Nintendo game. Star Fox, I think. I'd zoned out their entire conversation, instead opting to stare out the window. When we got to the Wanley town sign, I noticed something strange. There was a man from the sheriff's office using a roller to add something to the sign. All I saw was the word no. There were several police cars blocking the road into town. I recognized the faces of the officers, but I hadn't talked to them before. There weren't a lot of criminals in Wanley, and my family were all in the straight and narrow. Even my dad, who joked about being a bank robber. He wasn't. He was a corporate lawyer. The bus stopped, and so did the conversation. No more Star Fox. The double doors at the front of the bus whooshed open, and an older policeman stepped on board with his hands on his walkie-talkie. He looked at the driver and nodded, then turned to us. "Hey there, kids," he said. "I'm Officer Gellan. We're not going to keep you here too long. We just need to have a little talk, if that's okay. Is that okay, kids?" There was a muttering yes coming from the Wanley Middle School children, myself included. Officer Gellin nodded, hiding a wide smile under a wild mustache. "Alright, I'll be back. Sir, would you accompany me out for a sec?" The driver stepped outside with Officer Gellin. Meanwhile, the rest of us kept looking around, trying to see what was wrong. "Maybe there's an accident," said one of the younger kids. "Maybe someone got hurt." "I think there's a fire," said another. "Mom says we can't barbecue because of fire hazard." "Maybe there's a murderer," said the Star Fox kid, "and they found, like, heads and stuff." "Gross," I added. "You're gross." I looked back outside as the other kids started to squabble. It went from fire to accident to murderers to space aliens, then right back to talking Star Fox. Meanwhile, I stared off in the distance, and that, in turn, gave me an idea. I could see the back of the town sign from the rearview window. I leaned back and looked out. The sign read, "You're now leaving Wanley." But there was a large white text box added to it. "No milk." Before I got the chance to tell the other kids, Officer Gellin came back on board. The driver got back in his seat. "I had a very productive talk with Mr. Harley here, and he tells me that I've stumbled upon a particularly crafty and well-behaved group of students. Is he right about that? Is that what you are?" Of course we were. In unison, we agreed with Officer Gellin. "Well, in that case, you might be able to help me out. See, we're looking for a special something that we can't bring into town, or people might get sick. And we wouldn't want anyone to get sick now, would we?" "Of course not." "Then I hope you won't mind some of my officers checking your backpacks to make sure nothing bad snuck along, would you?" 2 officers stepped on board as Gellin hurried outside to halt an approaching sedan. Someone was trying to get out of town, but was turned away. One by one, the officer had a short talk with us and went through our backpacks. Our lunches specifically. When they got to the Star Fox kid just ahead of me, I heard them asking him a series of questions: what he'd been eating, how long ago, if he'd gone to the bathroom since. Strange questions. Turns out, he had chocolate milk as part of his lunch. The officer who asked clicked his walkie-talkie twice, some sort of discreet signal. When they got to me, I handed them my backpack. "Have you had anything to drink today?" he asked. "My mom made lemonade," I said. "That sounds great. Wish my mom made me some." He smiled. "Anything to eat? Any cheese? Any milk?" "Just fish sticks and rice," I said, "and ketchup." "Doesn't sound too bad." He rummaged through the backpack and seemed relieved not to find what he was looking for. "Alright, looks like we're done. You have a good weekend now." "You too." Once they'd gone through every backpack, they circled back to the Star Fox kid. They asked him to come along and said they had to ask a couple more questions. It was scary. He started crying, and they tried to encourage him every step of the way. They said they were going to call his parents and everything was going to be fine. I wasn't so sure. Once the bus started rolling, I looked back to see Officer Gellin in the rear window. He wasn't smiling anymore. He had this grim look on his face, staring straight into the asphalt, motionless. There was a long line of cars being turned away. Some cars I recognized. Friend and neighbours looking to make a quick exit. The bus had to pull to the side at one point to let a fire truck pass. I got the impression that something big had happened, but no one was telling me what it was. The conversation had died down, and I had to fill the silence with my worries. There was no chatter to distract me. By the time we got to the bus stop, I saw all our parents lined up, my mum and dad included. Amos was also there. He'd taken an earlier bus and had been home since lunch. As I stepped off, my dad swept me up in his arms. Mum was crying. "What did they do?" Dad asked. "Did they take anything? What did they ask you?" Mum took me from him. "Give it a rest, Morgan," she spat. "Let's go home." Amos seemed disinterested, instead clutching a Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles comic that they bribed him with. There was a man in camouflage with an assault rifle walking up and down the street, asking people to disperse and return to their homes. Mom and Dad hurried back to the car, sticking me and Amos in the back. He went straight to reading his comic, but I kept looking out the window. As we got back on the road heading home, I noticed several strange signs. The most prominent one was on the window of a corner shop. "No milk by order of the National Guard." When we took the road by the Bowes Dairy Farm, I heard popping noises. Before I got the chance to ask, my dad intervened. "They're celebrating," he said. "It's just fireworks." We lived at the end of a street, next to a roundabout. We had 3 neighbouring houses. 2 of them were elderly couples who rarely left their homes, and the last was another family with a teenage boy. We'd hung out a bit before he started high school, but we'd fallen out of touch in the last year or so. Still, I had fond memories of watching movies on their big screen TV and playing video games. I bet they had the new Star Fox game. As we turned the corner, the street was in chaos. The Masons were out on the lawn, arguing with 2 fire marshals. The other elderly couple, the Stevensons, were dragging bags to their car. The other family were nowhere to be seen, and their SUV wasn't in the driveway. The front door was half open and the lock broken. There was a piece of white paper with red text nailed to the side of the door. "Just go to your rooms," Dad said. "We'll talk over dinner." "But what's going on?" I asked. "We'll talk about it later," he insisted. "For now, I need you to stay in your rooms." Amos looked up from his comic book. "Can I play Nintendo?" "As long as you want, honey," Mom smiled. "And tonight, there's no bedtime." Amos looked up at me like we were going to Disneyland. It took him a moment to realize that he was the only one smiling, and he didn't understand why. To be fair, neither did I. We hurried inside. Amos and I ran upstairs and got to our rooms. Amos had been allowed to keep the Super Nintendo in his room, while I had a VCR. It was fair enough. He could play games, and I could watch movies. But I wasn't in a mood to watch anything. I had this sinking feeling that something was terribly wrong, and I kept looking out the window, hoping to see something. The Stevensons were arguing next to their car, and the Masons were being ushered back into their house. I could see smokestacks rising from the dairy farms, and flashing lights from fire trucks going back and forth down Main Street. Every now and then, if I listened closely, I could hear popping noises. It didn't sound like fireworks. It sounded like gunshots. I'd only been in my room for a couple of minutes before I heard a careful tapping at the door. Amos stepped in with this haunted look on his face, his eyes wide and unblinking. "Can you help me with my science project?" he asked. "It's acting funny." Amos had been working on a science project for school. It wasn't a big deal. He'd taken different kinds of milk and placed them in cups to see which ones went bad first. He usually checked it before he went to bed, making notes about changes over time. "Can you please look?" he asked. "It's really weird." "All right." For something to make Amos say please, it had to be something out of the ordinary. I walked across the hall to his room, catching a whiff of an argument downstairs. Mom had raised her voice. There was a certain pitch to it when she was worried about something, and she wasn't holding back this time. Made me feel sorry for Dad. Half the time, it wasn't even him she was angry at. I followed Amos past the pause screen for Contra 3 and up to the window. He had the cups resting on a small metal tray with plastic wrapping. He stopped just ahead of it. "I heard this noise and—" He pointed at the cups, clutching his notebook. "I haven't opened it. Mom says it smells too much." As I approached, I saw the cups rattle. Not much, but enough to make a noise. I could see the plastic wrap shaking. Looking into the cups, it took me a while to understand what I was looking at. At first, I thought it was maggots, but it wasn't. It looked like something had coalesced at the bottom of each cup, and there were these tiny white strands shooting out of it, prodding the plastic for weaknesses. It sort of looked like an egg in a way, with these inches-long strands that moved independently of one another, all of it milky white. "It keeps moving," he said. "Look." He stepped up to it and put his finger on top of the plastic. The strands in the cup immediately reacted, shooting straight up. It looked almost electric in a way. "Why does it do that?" he asked. "Don't touch it," I said. "We gotta put it away." "Should we tell Mom?" I could hear them arguing downstairs and shook my head. "We should throw it away," I said. "Let's flush it." Amos protested all the way to the bathroom, but didn't want to make a fuss. I told him I'd take the blame, and he could go back to playing Contra. That seemed to do the trick. I placed the tray on the floor next to the toilet. I put on Mom's plastic cleaning gloves just in case. As I took off the plastic wrap, those little white strands shot out of the cup, aiming straight at my face. They were a lot longer than I'd suspected, just inches away from my face. I panicked and dropped the entire cups down the toilet with a squeal. Looking down, they squirmed and twisted back and forth, these white strands whipping around like worms in agony. It was so much longer than I'd anticipated, and I could feel them prodding against the plastic gloves. They were looking for the warmth of my skin. The tips were much sharper than anticipated and almost poked a hole in my gloves. I flushed. After waiting a few seconds, I could see some strands moving at the bottom of the bowl. I flushed again and again and again. Finally, there was nothing left. I dumped half a bottle of toilet cleaner in, flushed again, and waited. I must have sat there for 10 minutes, just watching the water. There was this tingle in my spine, like I'd escaped some great danger. The same kind of rush you'd get if you'd nearly stepped on a snake or seen a bear. I went back to my room and brought out a notebook. "No milk," I wrote at the top. I tried to name all the places in town where there might be a lot of milk or milk-based products. The dairy farms were obvious, but there were also the high school cafeteria, the corner shop with a soft-serve ice cream, and the convenience store. Since this was a town with several dairy farms, milk and cheese was sort of everywhere. I listed at least 24 locations where there might be a lot of dairy products. There was a loud banging on the front door downstairs. Amos and I rushed out of our rooms to see what was going on. From upstairs, I saw Dad open the door to a man in military uniform. Mom looked up the stairs. "Get back in your rooms," she said. "We'll tell you when you can come out, alright?" "Mom, what's going on?" "Just play your games," she said. "Wait there." "But Mom, Rooms," she yelled. "Now!" She wasn't messing around. Amos and I looked at one another and silently decided to stick together on this one. There was a discussion between my parents and the man at the door. Amos and I retreated back to my room. He kept reading, but he kept getting distracted. "You think it's bad?" he asked, putting down his comic book. Amos had always been a bit of a pain. Lots of pranks and scares. But this time was different. We weren't playing around. It was like a silent agreement. "Yeah," I said. "I think so." "Why? What's so bad?" "I think there's something wrong with the milk." "But you flushed it, right?" "Not just that milk," I said. "All of it. All milk in town. It's all gone bad." "Worse," I said. "Like, real bad." What happened next was quick. I heard someone coming up the stairs, and in the next moment, my parents opened the door to my room. They asked us to remain calm. They asked us to be quiet. They asked us to come along, stay close, and don't ask any questions. On our way out, I saw the man in uniform stepping into our upstairs bathroom. Seconds later, he sprinted back out, yelling into his walkie-talkie. Mom and Dad hurried us downstairs. 3 other men rushed past us, up the stairs, dragging dirt and mud through the living room carpet on their way up. All in uniform, all armed with assault rifles. They left the front door open, and I could see at least 6 more people waiting outside. We got in our car, taking nothing with us except Amos's comic book. A man tapped the driver's seat window with his rifle, and my dad took off down the road. "We can't get out of town," Mum said, keeping her voice low. "Morgan, they're testing women at the checkpoints." "Maybe it's for the better," Dad said. "Who knows how this can affect you? You might need a vaccine." "You've seen what they did with the dairy cows. They take them out back and then..." "We're not cattle, Raniel. They're not putting people down. They're not putting people, Rani, out to pasture." "Then where the hell are the goddamn Abernathys?" Mum roared back. "Them being dragged off was just for fun? For show?" "We're not having this discussion," Dad said. "Not in front of the kids." "I'm almost in the 2nd trimester," she whispered. "And God knows what they'll do if..." Mom quieted down, holding her hand to her mouth. Dad looked at her with a mix of pity and frustration. "I feel strange, Morgan," she continued. "And it's not like last time. There's this big 4-way intersection in the middle of the downtown area. When we got to that point, the lights had turned red. There were these military trucks going by one, at least a dozen, covered in blue plastic tarps. Long after the lights turned green, the trucks were still going by. As the second to last truck was going by, there was this loud metal bang, and the entire truck started leaning. For a moment, we all thought it was going to tip over. Two of the wheels were off the ground. It tipped back down, and the driver leaned on the horn. From seemingly every corner of the street, armed men started shouting at us to move. I could see something moving under the tarp, something sharp poking and prodding against the plastic. I'd seen it before. Dad stepped on the gas, going the other way. I saw the high school gymnasium in the distance, lined with vehicles all along the street. They told us to stay here, Dad said. Let's just hunker down and wait. We'll be trapped. We can leave at any time. We can't go by foot. I don't like the look of those rifles. You know they wouldn't. They exchanged a glance, and the conversation stopped. Amos and I just kept our heads down. There were still popping sounds outside. They were closer now. Dad found a spot further down the street, and we made our way to the gymnasium. There were at least 100 people gathered outside. I picked up a few things from various discussions going around. For example, the armed men were from the National Guard. Most of them had showed up early that morning, probably minutes after I'd left for school. There was a lot of talk from a lot of people. A soldier explaining something about lactic acid bacteria to one of our science teachers. An old man complaining about how they took his freezer. A kid being scolded for not telling his mom he had a milkshake with his lunch. A farmhand looking distraught, saying something about the new cow feed used by Anson Farm and how it was unfair for the bows to get shut down. Bits and pieces of 100 different stories. But what struck me the most was a group of young women looking distraught. One of them kept repeating the same thing over and over to a soldier. "I'll get rid of it," she said. It's in there, for good." We had to sign our names on the way in. Dad signed for the four of us. I barely recognized anyone. They'd set up green military cots 2 by 2 with a basic footlocker for valuables and personal belongings. Dad weaved between aisles of cots, keeping me and Amos close. Mom was looking for the restroom. "When can we go back to the house?" Amos asked. "They're checking the pipes," Dad said. "That can take a while." "Checking the pipes for what?" "I don't know, but whatever it is, they're making sure we're okay." A stone sunk into my stomach. Maybe what I'd flushed down the toilet had gotten stuck in the pipe somehow. Maybe that's what they saw. For the next few hours, we stayed put. They handed out a couple of basic dairy-free meals. Once every 2 hours, there were a couple of soldiers walking down the aisles, making sure everyone looked okay. But people were far from okay. I saw this one athletic guy shaking like a leaf, coughing into his hand over and over. It sounded awful, like his body was trying to push something out. When the patrol made their rounds, they took him outside. I didn't see him again. Mom was in the bathroom for a long time, at least an hour. When she got back, she had this slightly ashen complexion, like she hadn't slept for days. Dad was worried, but she kept telling him she was okay. Once it started to get dark, the patrol said they were closing down for the night. A curfew was in effect. Dad had all kinds of questions, but didn't want to start arguing with armed soldiers. I could tell he was holding back. Corporate lawyer or no, personal freedoms are a big sticking point to him. I remember this big clock over the scoreboard. If you managed to filter out the cries and the occasional scream, that clock was the only thing you could hear. And I could swear that the seconds were getting longer the more you listened to it. Mom and Dad shared a cot, while Amos and I got one each. Amos went out like a light, but I stayed up long after midnight. I couldn't help it. That damn clock kept me up. With the lights off, all I saw was the sharp shadows cast by the crescent moon creeping in through the cloud cover. As the screams and cries turned to snivels and snores, I was left awake, staring into the ceiling. I heard someone whispering about megabacteria, something in the methane, the lactic acid, the gas lines. Nobody knew for sure. There was one guy who kept muttering about birds being the source, claiming it had rained feathers moments before things hit the fan. There was this one drunk man by the exit who kept talking out loud to himself. They dance like skinny little worms, reaching for the stars. Skinny little worms, just like I'd seen in my brother's science project. I'd been drifting in and out of sleep for 1 or 2 hours when I snapped to attention. I heard someone running past me and looked up to see Mom's side of the cot empty. Dad sat up, rubbing the sleep out of his eyes. "Rainy?" he whispered. He noticed me looking his way. "You see where Mom went?" I shook my head. He got up and took me by the hand. "Let's go look." We went down the aisles, hand in hand. It was eerie watching all these strangers sleeping around us, like nothing was going on. Even the drunk guy by the exit was out cold by now. I don't know if I was imagining things, but I had the mental image of those skinny little worms appearing. Sometimes when I looked at the sleeping people, I imagined little shadows scurrying to hide. Something crawling out of a nose, an ear, a mouth. We walked past this one man who looked sick, who had a metal bucket next to his cot. I could hear little tapping movements from the bottom of it, as if something was struggling to reach out. "She might be in the bathroom," Dad said. "Let's go look." There were 2 patrolmen by the bleachers, smoking and telling stories. They kept passing a bottle back and forth. Dad kept his head down, making sure not to look them in the eye. We went through a short hallway and made it to the bathrooms. The power was still on, but all the lights were off, making the emergency exit sign the only thing to guide us. Dad was about to step inside the bathroom when I tugged on his sleeve. "That's for the ladies, Dad," I said. "I'm sure they won't mind." We stepped through the door. Moonlight was coming in from a frosted glass window, casting an eerie shadow across the floor. We split up and started knocking on the stalls. It was quiet. Dad had this worried look on his face. "Maybe you should step outside for this," he said, "just for a while." "Let's check," I said. "It'll be quick." "Wait, let's..." I opened one of the stalls. I barely saw anything. In the moonlight, I couldn't see much more than outlines. I saw a pair of still hands holding up a bloated belly, with these little dancing worms pushing their way out of the skin, like a goddamn human garlic press. The tapping sound of 100 thin parasites looking for a new host. Some were just an inch long, others were as tall as an arm. One of them poked the nail on my thumb, but it couldn't latch on. I saw chunks of hair strewn across the floor, a side effect of late-stage infection. A hand fell over my eyes and I was dragged outside. When I looked up, I saw Dad. His entire body language had changed, like he was in pain. For a few seconds, all he did was stare at me. Then there was a bang on the door, coming from the inside. "I need to get your brother," he said. "I need to get to your brother, and I need you to get to the car." "But Dad, what?" "Here," he handed me the car keys. "I'm trusting you, and I need you to hurry." "But what about—" Another bang on the door. Dad straightened his back and pushed it shut. I stepped back, feeling my pulse rise through my chest. "Go," he yelled. "I'll meet you outside." Running back out, some of the cloud cover had cleared outside. I started running down the aisles, trying to find my way back to Amos. It was difficult. Everything looked different in the dark. There was this woman who got out of a cot just a few feet ahead of me. She coughed, and this avalanche of worms trickled out of her mouth. They spilled onto her chest and scattered across the floor. She turned to me, chunks of hair coming off her scalp. She wheezed at me, her brown eyes tired from crying. She tried to say something, to call for help, but all I heard was that inhuman wheezing as little white worms made their way across her chest. I don't know if I was the one who started it, but someone did. That first scream, that choir of screams as lives came crashing down. There were so many parasites, so many victims, some who just felt funny and tried to sleep it off, waking to a nightmare. Others had tried keeping their sickness a secret. There were no patterns, no limits. Everyone was susceptible. Young, old, strong, frail. There were some with parasites coming out of their stomachs, others through the ears, mouth and nose. There was this one man who had them in his left eye. As they reached out to others for help, the parasites spilled from one person to the next, boring into their skin. I didn't find Amos. He found me. He kept telling me that a bad man had taken his comic book and that he ran away looking for Dad and help. He asked 100 questions at once, but I just grabbed him and ran, clutching the car keys so hard that my hand cramped. We made our way to the exit, but there was a rush of people going in and out like a waterfall. Someone yelled, telling people to drop to the floor. 10 others screamed back, begging for help. Others just screeched like wounded animals, trying to alert the flock of incoming danger. Amos ducked to the floor, and I followed him. Then, the gunshots started. We got out by crawling on all fours. One of the soldiers tripped over me, accidentally kicking me across the ribs. When we got outside, we stuck to the wall and kept a low profile. Amos couldn't stop crying, but I just pulled him along. I could barely hear anything over my ringing ears and pounding pulse, as gunshot after gunshot rang out behind us. We crawled our way through the flower beds, using the high school's blue sunflowers as cover. Most people were stuck inside. Some made their way out, filtering back into the military tents outside. Amos and I made our way back to the car. My fingers barely worked as I fumbled to open the door. When I finally did, I could see more people heading our way from down the road. I got out the car and pushed Amos into the back seat. I followed him, locking the doors from the inside. We curled into the leg space between the back seat and front, hugging each other tight as I hushed him. He couldn't stop crying. He had so many questions piling up that they were overflowing into a jumbled mess. Questions about Mom, about Dad, about the people outside, about the bad man who took his comic book. As the gunfire died down, people started pouring out. But they weren't just people anymore. One of them noticed our car. One of them spotted us inside. And after that first one came another, and then another. In less than half an hour, there were so many of them, they were blocking all the windows. All I saw was silhouettes, and all I heard were wheezing noises. Bodies calling for help, begging, pressing themselves against the windows to get at us, rattling coughs over and over as something inhuman settled in their throats. I could only see part of them as they banged on our windows. There was this one man smiling at me with little worms dancing between the gaps in his yellow teeth. He pressed himself against the passenger window, meeting my gaze. "Bad man," he groaned. "Bad man, help." An eternity passed in the back of that car, and some time during that eternity, the noises stopped. Maybe they moved on. Maybe they got shot. I don't know. But at some point, the sun broke through, and we were both okay. Panicked, but okay. There were soldiers outside, rounding up people from the gymnasium and people from the tents. Some were sent back home after signing some documents. Others were asked to stay near their vehicles until further notice. And me? Well, I refused to open the door for anyone. Amos and I stayed in there for hours, until we could feel the heat baking us. Then, the door opened. My dad had a spare set of keys. Seeing his familiar face outside the passenger side window was everything I needed to know that, in some way, we'd be okay. He'd locked himself in one of the stalls and kept quiet all night. Looking back at it, he and everyone else were forced to sign some kind of agreement. We were given a hefty compensation, and all we could say was that it was killer bacteria coming from one of the dairy farms, which in a sense was true, but it didn't tell the whole truth. It took Dad years to build up the courage to tell me what really happened to Mom. 6 years, I think. Apparently, she was pregnant, but the whole thing had been a bit touch and go. They didn't want to tell us until they were sure. She was just at the point where her body had started lactating, and milk protein just... I don't know. I can't shake the feeling that maybe it was her that I saw in that stall. Dad took the money and left town. He and so many others. Some moved in, encouraged by the sudden price drop. I guess that's how the town made it all the way to 2023. 176 people died in total, directly or indirectly. But what they don't tell you is that thousands were permanently scarred. Some of the girls who just entered puberty had to get sterilized, or they might risk another outbreak years down the line. They did some tests on me as well, but determined I was fine. Amos too. Guys are affected differently. I still have that bacteria in me in some capacity. While I can eat and drink dairy nowadays, there is that part of me that just can't bring myself to try. The thought of reliving any part of that day gives me this sickening feeling in the pit of my stomach. I feel my pulse rising just thinking about it. Seeing that white liquid fills me with the sense that there is so much moving around in it that I just can't see. If it hadn't been for what happened that day in 1993, I think Wanley would have been fine. But as it stands, I'm glad it's finally gone. There's a story that my mom used to tell me. When I was a kid, she held me up to a telescope to show me the stars. I'd been born under an open sky 2 years prior. It was only fair that space and I got better acquainted. She showed me constellations like Ursa Major, Auriga, and Orion, and the moon, of course. Finally, she set the telescope to one specific point: Jupiter. Then, I started screaming. I went from warm and cuddly to a panicked, hell-screaming mini-beast at the drop of a hat. Mom never figured out why, and for many years, neither did I. "It's like he saw the boogeyman," she says whenever she tells the story. Or maybe he just didn't understand what he was looking at. All that mystery can be scary. My dad jokingly says that this telescope was the cause for my interest in geology. Better to look down than up, he figured. I never thought of it that way, but he had a point. Personally, I think I've always liked to understand the fundamental puzzle pieces that make this world live and breathe. That's what geology is to me. An understanding of our home, like knowing the foundations of your house. So yeah, I'm a geologist. I got my degree at MSU, got a master's degree in Norway, and got an entry-level job at a government agency in Reston, Virginia. By 2013, I was well on my way to earthquake-proofing my life and personal economy. Things were pretty sweet, but there were a few caveats. First, I was desperately lonely, and second, I hadn't used the telescope since that fateful day when I was 2 years old. But that changed in March 2013. I just turned 24. I'd kinda started dating this girl, Lynn. We'd only been out twice, but I had a good feeling about the third date. She was an intensely outdoorsy kind of person. She had all kinds of breathing fabric clothes, super hydro whatever water flasks, and she tracked everything about her life on an ergonomic hyper-digital buzzword watch with the accompanying monthly subscription app. It was all a bit much, and I couldn't keep up with her in any sense of the word. But she somehow tolerated me, and that was all that mattered. We'd been hiking all day. Lynn had been hinting at a surprise at the end of the road. It was already getting too dark to turn around, so I figured we might be sharing a tent. She hadn't told me to bring my own. As we got to the top of a hill, I realized I'd been an idiot. There was a camp of 6 other people, men and women, all variations of Lynn. Eager, sporty people with a violently upbeat vibe. Lynn turned to me with the biggest smile. "Surprise!" she laughed. "We got a stargazing party." Yeah, I'd misread the entire date thing. I was supposed to bring my own tent, but Lynn figured that was implied. Apparently, you should always bring a tent when hiking. I hate unwritten rules. In that moment, I was just a bitter man coming to the realization that we had vastly different ideas of what that date was going to look like. Still, I had a good time. We had hot dogs and s'mores, and our friends had put up telescopes to play with. There was supposed to be a meteor passing by, and they all wanted to see it. Honestly, I think it was just an excuse to get out of town for a while. One of Lynn's friends had brought a bottle of schnapps. Not much, but enough to play some Never Ever Ever and have a good laugh or two. By the time the meteor came around, we'd almost forgotten about it. Hell, I'd almost forgotten about Lynn. We all got up and took turns with the telescopes. It was sort of magical in a way. All of us standing on that hill, looking up at the clear sky. No light pollution, no passing cars, just a bunch of people and the stars. Then, it was my turn. Looking at it through the telescope makes it seem more real in a way. You can see details that you otherwise can't. It reminds you that the stars aren't just a pretty picture. They're real things in a very real space. I followed the meteor for a few seconds, oohing and ahhing with the rest of them. Then, it passed in front of Jupiter. Something in me stopped. It felt like my soul dropped anchor, locking my neck in place. Ever since that day when I was a kid, I hadn't seen the planet up close. Not like that. Not since. There was a rumble. At first, I thought it was some kind of motor error in the telescope tripod. Then, it happened again. I took my hands off the telescope, but quickly realized I couldn't look away. My neck was cramping, my throat closing. I couldn't blink, I couldn't scream, and the rumble grew stronger. It got faster, turning into a vibration or a note. There was a middle note, a high note, finally a low note. 3 repeating sounds bouncing against the inside of my cranium like an expanding echo. My eyes, searching desperately for a way to blink, finally locked onto something. There, among the swirling storms of Jupiter's surface, I could see spots of red. Some large, some small, and one so large it was impossible to miss. Now, I know what it is in theory. I've heard about the storms of Jupiter. It's a gas giant. But what I looked at then and there were no storms. They were eyes. Every storm, every spot, red eyes. I finally understood the rumbling, that feeling that bore through me, middle, high, low. It wasn't just spasms. They were syllables. The more I listened, the clearer they got, like fine-tuning a radio. And in that one perfect moment, as everything aligned, I heard it. I heard Jupiter. I felt it. Not as a voice, but a movement. A trembling bass, like standing next to a silent but deafening song. And it said, "I see you." For the other stargazers, it looked like I had a seizure. Lynn later described how I took one look through the telescope and immediately started shaking. She offered to get my coat, which I left by the campfire. When I finally pried myself loose from the telescope, all I could do was froth at the mouth and screech the same 3 tones over and over. But they didn't understand. How could they? Middle, high, low. I see you. I was only out for a couple of minutes. The circle of friends looked down at me, trying to figure out how bad the damages were. They'd fetched their first aid kits and Lynn's satellite phone. Prior to waking me up, they'd been arguing whether to call someone. They could also follow the blue tape on the trees, which would lead to a ranger station. Luckily, I woke up just in time to stop them. "I'm fine," I gasped. "Really, I don't know what the hell that was." "That's epilepsy," one of them said. "My cousin has it." "No, that's blood sugar," another said. "Guaranteed." Someone said something about chakras. Another started talking about the liver and pushing me to eat their special Minnesota sunflower seeds. What a wild night. The next day, I headed straight home. I said goodbye to Lynn who insisted that I kept her updated. I crashed in my bed, head first, leaving my hiking gear strewn across the hallway. Even though I'd gotten a good night's sleep, my mind needed to recover. My hands wouldn't stop shaking, and my eyes felt warm. I would get bouts of strained jaw muscles, sending these fiery signals up my spine to poke me like an infected wound. I slept for 14 hours straight. This long, dreamless sleep, like turning off a light and waking up with no idea what planet you're on. Waking up felt like starting a machine. Something in me moved, and I looked straight up to the ceiling. Without thinking, I said it aloud. I see you. I tried to chalk it all up to stress and fatigue. I'd been hiking all day and topped it off with booze. Not a great combination. I spent a few hours just looking up stuff about Jupiter to try and explain what I'd seen. I read about the storms, the composition of dust and gas, the invisible rings, the moons. It was all there. Jupiter is no mystery to us. But what I'd seen were no storms. It felt like I'd seen through them, spotting something beneath, something deep and profound, like breaking through the ice of a dark lake, only to see something shimmering at the bottom. I was at a crossroads. Try and ignore it, or confront it. What else could I do? I decided to ignore it. For a few days, it worked. There was the occasional shiver when I heard an uncomfortable tune or the frequency of a machine or motor. There was this one noise that I kept hearing from my fridge that gave me pause. At one point, I just stood there, head pressed against it, listening. Traces of that mysterious rumble looking to grasp me. Lynn and I kept in touch. She was worried about me, asking me to get checked out. I couldn't be bothered at first, but she made me promise. I thought about telling her I'd gone without actually going, but she was so sincere. I couldn't bring myself to lie, no matter how convenient. The doctor couldn't find anything wrong with me, not physically at least. I kept getting distracted by all the hums. I imagined hearing that frequency in a little bit of everything, directly translating to spotty words in the back of my mind. I could hear C coming off a computer screen, a U from the rumbling pipes in the bathroom. Just spots of recognition, sending flakes of ice up my spine as a constant reminder that I was, in fact, nowhere near okay. It all came to a breaking point one evening when I was making dinner. I was alternating between frying chicken and answering messages from Lynn when I got into what I can only explain as a groove. There was a hum coming from the kitchen fan which resonated exactly with one of the frequencies. It was calling to me over and over. You, 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 you. I have no idea how long I stood there. My mind just synced to this rhythm. At some point, I realized I was coughing, nodding my head to the alarm from the smoke detector going off. My chicken was burnt. I ended up pouring myself a bowl of powdered tomato soup, and even then, as I stirred it with my spoon, I imagined the storms on Jupiter, the red swirls hiding an unfathomable chaos. I watched it spin around and around and around again, and the longer I looked, I could feel the eye coming closer. My hands cramped, locking the plate in my hands. I could feel a rumble boiling in my stomach, like a volcano about to erupt. 3 familiar notes, translating to an immediate, marrow-curdling screech. "I see you." I threw the plate across the room. It shattered, and the red droplets spread across my egg-white wall, swirling dots dancing like distant Jupiter storms. The hum in me faded into a steady stream of whispers, whispers that eagerly reminded that I was, unquestionably, seen. For the next few nights, it just got worse. I prayed for a dreamless sleep, but it wouldn't come. Instead, I kept finding myself carried off into the void, coming face to face with an eye the size of continents, chemical storms that could strip the skin from bones, leaving only thoughts and screams behind. Knife-edged ruby mountain ranges circling an endless black iris. No matter how much I kicked, twisted, or turned, it sucked me in, pulling me into an eternal stomach-churning freefall. I would wake up drenched in sweat, completely off balance. I'd fall out of bed and flop around on the floor, as if gravity still eluded me. It'd take me a few seconds to realize nothing had happened. And maybe, if I was lucky, I'd gotten half an hour of sleep. I gave up. I told Lynn all about it, begging for help. She came over within the hour, drove me to the hospital, all that. Hell, I don't remember filling out a single form. She made sure they called my emergency contact and updated the doctor on what had been going on. She was unstoppable. I tried not to look and listen too much, and my mind was reeling from a lack of sleep. I have vague recollections of hallways and blurred faces. By then, I could feel the rumbling everywhere. Every electrical outlet, every fluorescent light. I could feel it in the texture of my rubber soles dragging across the white linoleum floor. It wasn't letting up. The only clear memory I have is of staring into the eyes of a doctor as I had a moment of clarity. He looked at me like I'd slapped him. "Good," he said. "Then your eyes are working." What? "You can see me, right?" He took down a few notes and checked my eyes. "You said so, just now." They kept me overnight for observation. My mum came by with some supplies and words of encouragement. She stroked my head and made sure I always had a glass of water on hand. Whenever my fever-like rants and seizures would start, she was there to calm me down. Well, to the best of her ability. At that point, I was so far gone that I couldn't even explain it to her. It was just this constant assault on my senses, like my brain was swollen with voices. Then, at some point, it stopped. I remember it clearly. Mom had opened a window overlooking the parking lot, and I had a clear view of the night. Distant stars making their way across the sky. After shivering constantly for days, the relaxation I experienced was indescribable, euphoric. This warm, enveloping feeling spread all throughout my body, like becoming a comfort blanket. Mom stroked my hair. "You always liked that," she said. "Remember, you used to sleep with the window open." I don't remember that." "No stuffed animals or nightlights, just an open window. Anything else, and we'd get a nasty tantrum." She sat with me for a while before she got up to use the restroom. When she got to the door, she turned back to me. "You know, the night when you were born, we never thought you'd make it," she said. It was all a mess. The car broke down. Your dad thought we could cut through a field to make it to the hospital on foot. I know, I sighed. I was born in a field. The paramedics found us, she continued. If it hadn't been for the bright night and the stars, they never would have. It saved your life. I looked out the window. There was something strangely comforting about that vast darkness now that it didn't fry my nerves. Like a dark sea where you can imagine the waves. We thought you wouldn't make it, but as soon as we heard them, we knew you'd be okay. A primal thought swam to the front of my mind. The vague feeling of people around me, being naked and cold in an open field, hands grasping me, a voice far above whispering, "Don't worry, kid." A breath that lasts for a lifetime. I see you. The next morning, I was discharged. My nerves had calmed, and I'd gotten a prescription for seizure medication. I was rolled out of the main entrance where Lynn met up with us. It wasn't the kind of introduction I'd planned on doing that day, but that time was as good as any. Mom had her promise to take me home, and Lynn was happy to help. We started the drive, and I immediately felt something strange. A tinge of something cold, like a snowflake hitting an open wound. "Do we need to stop?" she asked. "Are you okay?" "No, just wait." As I looked around, the feeling shifted, and at one specific point, it disappeared. It just disappeared. I followed the direction with my finger, pointing at something in the distance. "Can we go there?" I asked. "Right there, that way." "The highway?" "Sure, yeah." "To where?" "No clue." Lynn pondered it for a second, then nodded. "Highway it is." We followed it for hours and turned the day into a road trip. We crossed the state line into West Virginia somewhere in the afternoon, and Lynn didn't seem to mind. She made an adventure out of it. Between my spontaneous bouts of nausea and confusion, I enjoyed her company, not to mention the snacks she got us. As the sky starts to darken, I figured she'd have us turn around or look for a motel. But no, she kept going. I could feel the point in the distance shift faster and faster. We were getting closer. There was something there. Something that made the shaking fade and clarity return. A piece of me settling back to where it ought to be. We ended up going down a long gravel road. Every twist and turn came suddenly, forcing us to crawl at a snail's pace. Lynn didn't seem to mind though. She put on some John Denver and had her own little sing-along. "You don't have to do this," I said. "We could be here all night." "That's okay," she smiled. "You sure? A fourth date is a fourth date. I'm sure you've had better. I've had worse." As the gravel road turned to dirt and came to a stop, I could feel we were getting close. I tried to explain it, but I couldn't find the words. It was like a spot of nothing growing bigger. If I could just get there, I had this aching feeling that everything would, in one way or another, turn out okay. Lynn stopped to get a hiking pack, and that was that. Off we went. We wandered through the wild forest. There were no trails, no leads. It was just us, and a vague sense of direction. Lynn didn't seem to mind. She had both a compass, satellite phone, and all kinds of tools. 2 hours of dark nothing, and suddenly, light. It was almost midnight by then. A starlit sky opened as we stepped onto the top of a sort of ridge overlooking a lake. I could see almost all the way around it from there. In the distance, I spotted a few boats, fishermen. It was all quiet. No matter what direction I looked, it was all just quiet. I looked at Lynn and laughed. I was so relieved that I couldn't express it, like a muscle knot untying itself or a massive headache just melting away, like putting a soothing balm on my soul. I gave her a big hug, and she returned it in kind. I don't know why, but this is it, I smiled. This is the spot. I think we're in Greenbrier County. That's someplace special to you. Never been here before. Well then. I sat down and took in the scene. No humming, no whispers, no cold creeping down my spine. Just the silent night and distant lights from stars and fishermen. You want some soup? Lynn asked. I got a thermos. When did you... Got it in my pack, she smiled. Want some? Yeah, I nodded. That'd be great. She poured me a cup and handed it over. My eyes drifted upwards. Something red moving across the sky. I shook my head and turned away. My pulse started beating, and I dropped my cup of soup. I tapped the side of my head as if trying to realign an antenna. Lynn put a hand on my shoulder. You okay? The red in the sky, the red eye. I could feel it. I scrunched my face as hard as I could, telling myself it was all gonna pass, telling myself it was over. I'd won, and this was just an aftershock. Then Lynn spoke up. Is that a plane? She saw it too. I looked back at Lynn, seeing a red gleam in her eyes, a reflection of what loomed overhead. The joy faded from her. I could feel it too. Something was wrong. A reflex in me made me look up. A stupid, inane little reflex. A red swirl in the distant sky. A sailing star, long out of reach. My breath grew shallow as I realized I couldn't look away. Everything else faded as my sight was slowly swallowed by that distant vision. Lynn? Lynn! I called out, waving my hands behind me. Don't let it take... I felt her fingers brush against mine as the rumbling began. But this time, it was different. It was a pulse so powerful that my left eardrum immediately burst, leaving me screaming like a child on the ground. It burned me to my core, wrapping itself around my spine and squeezing, forcing these guttural sounds up through my esophagus. Somewhere far away, I could feel Lynn shaking me, but all I could focus on was that red dot in the sky. It resonated with me. With my every pulse, it pulsed back. Our duet, our signal. I choked to my lungs, spitting up the syllables like a hiccup. I see you. It grew faster and faster, turning from 3 syllables to 2, and gradually, just the sound. I see you. I see you. I you. Until finally, all that remained was a single word. The name, the signal, the thing. Ayo, ayo, ayo. and with every beat of my heart, the thing in the sky started to turn. I could hear Lynn in the distance, as though through a pane of thick glass. I heard her worry, screaming, fumbling to connect a satellite phone, only to be met with a pulsing static. She tried dragging me away, but was shocked with a burst of static electricity. Every hair in my body stood at attention, reaching for the stars, letting every breeze cut right through me. The red thing grew bigger. That something, a dust particle of the infinite, heading our way. It was a matter of minutes. Using a rope from a pack, Lynn managed to get a lasso hold of my legs. She dragged me away, but it was too late. It was like my nightmares, something distant and red growing bigger, swallowing everything. Ayo, ayo, ayo. In the moment of impact, something burst inside me. I coughed up something black and viscous. Perhaps it was the connection that tied me to this thing to begin with. Maybe it marked me at birth to demand a favor somewhere down the line. Maybe this was all something cashing in on my life. The sky burned my retinas, but only for a heartbeat. In nothing but a moment, the sky went from burning red to nothing. The ground shook. There was steam, and so much cold air was pushed out that Lynn was knocked off her feet. The red thing was shaped like a wedge. It came down at an angle, roughly the size of a school bus. It tore into the lake, cutting up a wound in the earth itself, effectively cracking a hole in the ground, revealing some sort of cave system underneath. In a matter of minutes, the entire lake was laid bare. All water drained into the caves beneath. What little remained of the red thing turned to ash. Red, swirling ash. Lynn propped me up against the tree. My head was ringing like a bell. My vision slowly returned as the pulse subsided. The black, viscous bob I coughed up quickly dried up into a powder, turning into flakes of metal. I tried to talk, but couldn't form the words. I couldn't hear myself. I was so disoriented that my body couldn't understand whether I was breathing or not, making me lightheaded. Leaning against the tree, I forced myself up. I had to see the aftermath. An entire lake drained in seconds. I could only see little parts of the fishermen's boats, some of which had been blown into the surrounding trees. There was no way they would have survived, much less the remaining fish, flopping around in the mud. I turned to Lynn, trying my best to speak. My body recognized all the physical sensations of speak, but couldn't form the words. Using my fingers, I gave her numbers, pointed to a satellite phone. We had to call goddamn everyone. The Army Corps, NOAA, the EPA, the Division of Natural Resources. Hell, I had to call my boss at the USGS. Everyone. We needed everyone. So we called them, one by one. And that was that. For me at least, things were finally peaceful. I couldn't feel it anymore. Maybe I'd served my purpose and paid my debt in a way. Over time, my eardrums would heal. Turns out I had a fractured rib and 2 throat ulcers. Still, I could overcome it. The whole situation was just absurd. There were reports of a small geological event without anyone mentioning the goddamn meteor that changed course to hit us. Coincidentally, there were also reports of escaped convicts. Residents were asked to stay inside. Despite having called literally everyone I could think of, I wasn't allowed anywhere near the site. I got no updates, no debriefing, nothing. The only thing I got was one of the corporate landowners telling me I'd been trouble enough. That line alone tells me they know something I don't, and it bothers me still. But there are only so many brick walls you can beat your head against. At some point, you get too dumb to care. That's where I'm at now. The past few years, I've been able to look up into the sky without a twitch of a care. I've looked at Jupiter countless times, and I can't even imagine what I used to see anymore. I know there's something there, but it's like a filter. Something in my mind can't look past it anymore. And Lynn? Well, it was her idea to write this down. She thinks there are people out there who might have seen something about this, other perspectives. We know for a fact there was a cover-up at the local news station, and someone must have been down at the lake. For me, the only thing that still remains is that word. That strange sound, meaning nothing and everything, like something out of a dead language, begging to return. I can say it 100 times, but there's no point anymore. It feels like it has burned me out. There's nothing left to make it sound true. Ayo, just a noise. I hope someone out there can make use of the truth, get some kind of closure, as Lynn and I are expecting our second daughter any day now. I feel like this chapter needs to be closed once and for all. And no, she won't be born under the stars.